Makati Productions presents an original Star Wars story, White Snow. Commencement. Written by Vader 1138. A Mandalorian bounty hunter takes a contract that will change his life forever. A captive Imperial, falsely accused of treason, sets out on a journey that will take her across the galaxy and back again. Te Arpadike's Drasher Drow Kershis. From tiny seas grow mighty trees. A Mandalorian proverb. Blue Send Naval Base and Military Prison, Javilian Forest, Coralag. Imperial General Pontius Loon struggled to keep his cap on his head as the wind tugged it about. He kept his eyes fixed on the sky, watching nervously as the dark shuttle swung and low over the prison with a warbling roar of engine discharge. He didn't move as the ship rumbled over his head. He didn't even blink until the shuttle had safely glided down to the pad and extended its landing ramp. Coolant steam wafted up from the ground, cloaking the ship's entrance. Loon found it disconcerting and, quite frankly, terrifying. The theatrics were made even worse by the knowledge of just who was waiting aboard the ship. But he didn't let any of his fear show and instead straightened and waited patiently as the exit ramp lowered in front of him. The rain slapped loudly against the bleached white armor of the 6 lines of stormtroopers arrayed behind him, every single one standing at attention despite the dreadful weather. Loon himself was not graced with plastoid armor plating and simply had to endure the rain. With a hiss of escaping coolant and a few final bursts of steam, the ramp from the triangular landing craft hit the pad's surface with a dull thud, and the entry door slid open. A single wheezing, mechanical breath split the air, audible even over the driving rain. Lightning flashed across the sky, soon followed by a clap of thunder that seemed to greet the shadow that strode down the ramp. As it moved through the fog, black armor glinted in the glare of the red landing lights of the craft. Loon felt his heart skip a beat at the sight and cringed at the sound of heavy footfalls on the metal ramp. The general gulped and saluted as Darth Vader strode out from the haze of steam, walking with an assured gait that only the Emperor's right-hand man could pull off. His cape billowed out around his broad shoulders as he walked, his leather-bound hands clenched into tight fists as he surveyed the troops arrayed before him. With a single rasping breath, he continued his march forward. Loon had never met Vader personally before, but everyone knew the reputation the Dark Lord had earned for himself. Word around the base was that he could snap a man's neck with merely his thoughts. The same rumors claimed that he could hunt down and expose one's deepest, most secret thoughts like a massif hunting for a piece of meat. Relentless was only one of the words that the soldiers had used to describe Lord Vader. Loon had dismissed this as simple rumor. But now that Lord Vader was actually here, he was beginning to wish he paid better attention. The Dark Lord nodded silently in greeting and beckoned Loon to follow him. The rain made quiet pattering sounds as it hit his menacing black faceplate, and his midnight black cape flapped wildly as the wind tugged at it. Loon jumped and fell into step next to the Sith Lord. I'd have rolled out the full red carpet for you, Lord Vader, he said, shouting to be heard over the sound of the rain and thunder, be but as you can see. Vader dismissively waved a gloved hand in the air and finally spoke in his mechanized baritone boom. You may skip your pitiable attempts at humor, General. You know as well as I that my presence here is not a publicity stunt. Oh, of course, Lord Vader, but... Vader interrupted him again, coming to a halt and studying his surroundings with fists planted on his hips. You have within this prison more than 200 suspected insurgents. I am here to see only one. Where's she? Prison Wing A3, Loon replied as lightning cracked overhead. He waited for the ensuing thunder to fade before continuing. Her execution is in 3 days. Vader nodded and set off in that direction at a brisk pace. Loon stumbled after him, putting a hand against his cap again to keep it from blowing away. I see no need to interrogate her, my lord. She is obviously guilty of treason. The evidence gathered against her will attest to that. Why try and get a confession out of her now? Her treachery is not what concerns me. She is not the cause of this growing militia that opposes us, nor does she hold a position of prominence useful to our plans. What I wish to know is exactly who planted the first seeds of rebellious thought within her mind. You, Suspect Jedi. The exact wrong words. Vader rounded on Lewin and pointed a finger at his chest. Lewin cowered back, shrinking beneath the menacing figure towering over him. The Jedi are all but extinct, General Lewin, Vader boomed. Those rare few who managed to survive the Great Purge are now little more than hermits. Exiles. And I will not allow rumors that they are the cause of this revolt to spread among the ranks. Do I make myself clear? Absolutely, my lord. Vader nodded, temporarily satisfied, and stared at the prison compound once more. He took a slow, wheezing breath. And once I have finished with the prisoner, bring me the pilot and co-pilot of my shuttle. Why? Lewin asked before he could stop himself. He cringed and bowed his head when Vader turned that angular death's head helmet back to face him. My reasons are not your concern, General. See to it that they are awaiting my return. That is all. With that, the Dark Lord strode towards the compound. Lightning flashed again, much closer this time, sending blinding highlights across his polished armor. The wind began to pick up and Lewin had to put a hand on his head to keep his cap from blowing away. My lord, he called after Vader. How long will you be speaking with the prisoner? As long as necessary. The Dark Lord gestured with a single finger and the door slid open. With the swirl of his cape, he turned and disappeared down the brightly lit hall. Chapter 3. The Prisoner. There is a strange excitement to be found in thunderstorms. Anyone who has spent time on an agrarian world, who has seen towering masses of roiling purple-black rain clouds on the horizon, can agree. There is a tension to thunderstorms that is quite unlike any other sensation. And when that tension snaps and the storm breaks, something quite intriguing falls over those caught beneath those clouds. Every crack of lightning, every deafening clap of thunder serves to excite the senses and send adrenaline-fueled shivers through even the most hardened of beings. Some would argue that many events, space battles, for example, are far more loud, angry, and disruptive. Indeed, one would be hard-pressed to claim that a simple thunderstorm is more exciting than the earth-shattering report of a Star Destroyer's turbolaser batteries. But there is something special about thunderstorms. Something thrillingly ancient about the deep rumble of thunder or the swift flash of light across the tumultuous sky. Something that stirs a person's baser, more primal nature. Something that harkens back to a time when life was a simple matter of kill or be killed, and where something as simple as a thunderstorm could easily kill. Karulak was no stranger to thunderstorms, but these primal feelings of excitement evoked by the thunder, the thrill of hearing the heavens roar like a great beast, were lost on the tiny, disheveled woman sitting in her Durcrete cell. When the lightning cracked outside, the woman flinched away from it, hugging her knees close to her chest and covering her ears against the mighty roar of thunder that inevitably followed. Every now and then, a whimper could be heard from her cell. Otherwise, she was silent. Out of the tiny cell window, barred and ray shielded to prevent her escape, of course, the prisoner saw armored stormtroopers marching back and forth in the courtyard outside, standing guard in even the worst of weather. These men were definitely caught up in the thrill and threat of the storm. They flinched slightly and cursed when a stray lightning bolt hit the ground a few hundred meters from them. A few of the newer recruits abandoned their posts and scrambled for cover, at least until the present officers shouted at them to get back into position. Some rubbed the rain from their contoured helmets or complained about the dismal weather. Despite their complaints, they were probably better suited to the weather than the dirty woman in her dirty cell. Their helmet visors darkened to protect their sight from the blinding flashes of lightning, and their audio links dampened the sound of the subsequent roars of thunder. The woman had never worn the armor herself, but she knew from a few friends that the helmets contained a dizzying array of technology, all intended to give the wearer optimum functionality in any environment. Radio scanners and motion sensors, Team COMM readouts and frequency scrubbers, in addition to a myriad of other systems crowded the helmets, all vying for the wearer's attention. Her friends had also informed her that, even without all the strange and awe-inspiring technology, it was almost impossible to see anything through the helmet's tinted eye-shaped visors. The door at the far end of the hall opened with a rusty squeak. The woman didn't bother to look up to greet the newcomer to her cell block. She barely even moved. She just sat with her back pressed up against the wall, alternating between covering her head with her arms, staring out the window, and gazing absently at her shivering filth-streaked hands. Captain J. Colta, now known only as Prisoner 27, winced visibly as the lightning strike lit up her bare cell for what seemed like the 1,000th time. She tried to draw further into the corner of the room, away from the noise and the flashes. But her back was pressed tight against the rough and damp surface of the Durcrete wall, and she was wedged as far into the corner as she could get. Thunder split the air again, rumbling through the room so loud she could feel the vibrations in her sternum. She covered her ears until the worst of the noise had faded away, then sighed and let the back of her head hit the hard surface of the wall behind her. Fearfeck, she hated that sound. And this far north, deep in the mountain wilderness of Kurulag, there seemed to be rain and thunder all the time. During the short time she had been taken outside, she had been given a short glimpse of the valley in which the prison was hidden. The sky was foggy and gray, thick with rain, and the tall conifer trees dripped with condensation. Normally it would have been a beautiful sight, maybe even one worthy of a holocaured image. But she had been miserable for so long it seemed she would never be able to remember what beauty really was. Everything around her looked dull and sapped of life, like even the world had lost interest in functioning and simply existed for the sake of existing. The ties flying overhead were no more frightening than the steady hum of the power cables beneath her cell, and the barking and shouting of stormtroopers was no more interesting than the chattering of birds in the forest. Everything now had fallen away to a monotonous drum of day-in, day-out melancholy. She ate only when necessary, and used the filth-encrusted fresher only when necessary. She stood for inspection, her back to the door, and her hands against the wall, when she was told to, just as she filed out for her solitary exercise hour when she was told to. Where once had been a vibrant woman, full of joy and life, there now stood a hollow shell that could barely be called a person. She continued to live only because she could not physically will herself to die. A stormtrooper walked past her cell, his plastoid armor looking as dull and dirty as she felt. It didn't surprise her. From what she'd been able to gather, this was a very secretive prison where all kinds of horrible things happened. Supplies were therefore scarce, and other nearby Imperial outposts, wary of their neighbors regardless of rank or superiority, did their best to further hinder the prison's secretive work. Experimental interrogation was what the troopers called it. Alternative questioning. Aggressive negotiations. They whispered it in hushed tones whenever one of the black-clad prison workers passed them by. They hissed it to each other as they tried to get a glance inside the highly classified interrogation rooms, when they poked and prodded at unconscious prisoners who had been beaten, drugged, and violated until they could barely move. The prisoners were not so fascinated with the prison's secretive proceedings, nor were they so candid with their labeling. Torture was torture no matter what it was called. Thankfully, Jay hadn't been taken to the torture wing of the prison. At least not yet. It seemed the Empire simply wanted her dead. She wasn't even important enough to warrant the drawn-out torture and painful execution on which the local Imperials prided themselves, not that she was complaining. Her muscles screamed from inactivity, and her stomach let out an angry growl every few minutes. The food in the prison was awful, but she had given up trying to go without it after 3 days of not eating, when she had begun feeling dizzy from hunger. Now she just choked it down and hoped it stayed down. The red floodlights that illuminated her room flickered in response to yet another nearby bolt of lightning. For a single heart-stopping moment, she thought she saw the rippling, light-bending shields that stretched across her cell door flicker as well. But she knew it was just her imagination, knew the shields were just as impenetrable as ever. They remained in place, glowing a dull scarlet and humming quietly. After the thunderclap faded, she leaned against the wall, letting her head thump against the cold Durcrete behind her. The rain continued to patter hard against her ray-shielded window, lulling her into a fitful semi-doze. And as always, when her mind began to wander, the questions began to return. How much longer would she be trapped here? How much longer before they just put her out of her misery? And, Perhaps most important of all, why was she here in the first place? She felt despair creep into her heart once more at the thought. She didn't have an answer, and it seemed that every time she asked the question it gave birth to another. After months in prison, her list of questions had grown quite long. Why was she, a good-mannered, attractive, and above all loyal Imperial pilot, in a cell after a nearly perfect 4-year service record? Why was she still alive after everything that had happened? And what kind of sick galaxy was this where she lived while all her friends had died horrid, terrified deaths? The Empire didn't tolerate failure. It wasn't surprising, and Jay had known that since she before had joined the Navy. The rank-and-file soldiers were full of tales about negligent or unskilled troopers who had been imprisoned or executed for their failures. The Empire, she had been told, was tough but fair. But now she knew that same intolerance bordered on outright paranoia. She had been imprisoned here for a crime she hadn't committed. For a crime she would never have dreamed of committing. Dereliction of duty. Treason. Jay, with her sterling military reputation and her knack for stopping trouble, for defusing explosive situations, as a general had once commented, she was about as imperial as someone could get. In fact, the lightning flashed even closer, hitting somewhere inside the compound this time. The enormous clap of thunder that instantly followed it was loud enough to shake dust loose from the ceiling and leave Jay's eyes watering. Even the stormtrooper outside her cell covered his helmet's audio receivers. After her ears had stopped ringing, she heard shouting outside her window. The stormtroopers outside had finally leaped into action, running back and forth and shouting orders to get everyone inside. Most were scrambling for cover, hands over their heads as if under attack. Officers gesticulated wildly and shouted for their troops to head for cover. 2 of the Imperials were carrying a smoldering gray mass between them that almost looked like a limp man in twisted, warped armor. Well, what did they think would happen, parading around in a thunderstorm covered in metal armor? She bit back a grin, feeling a small flush of bitter satisfaction at seeing her captors in such disarray. Stormtroopers. You're right. The soldiers quickly fled inside, out of the storm, and her interest in the outside world quickly ebbed. Settling back into her earlier position in the corner, she closed her eyes and lost herself in the sounds of the pattering rain, letting her vivid imagination take her back to happier times. She knew losing herself in the past was dangerous, but it was the way she passed the days now, thinking back to the days when she'd been accepted and respected. Days when she'd been part of a group that was so close they were almost a family. A slight smile flashed across her lips as her fellow pilots' faces and call signs flitted through her mind. Kalen was one of the first on her mind. Also known by his handle, Dewback, the daredevil Coruscanti pilot had been the joker of their little group and never ceased to bring a smile to her face. As such, she and the young man had been fast friends almost since her first days in the Navy. She could still see his grinning face, his mop of messy black hair, and the pencil-thin blowtorch that he had always spun between his fingers, a habit he never tried to break even behind the cockpit. Tyrana had always hated her nickname of Red Dwarf, and with good reason. Short of stature and sporting a short tail of blazing red hair, it had been only minutes before the others had come up with her nickname. Despite her usually surly attitude and combative nature, she had been a talented pilot and a loyal friend. In the cockpit she was fast, silent, and effective during the most pitched battles. Filton had been nicknamed Yesser because of his conciliatory nature and his status as a constant suck-up in search of promotion. They had teased him about this, of course, with all the good-natured but undying ferocity of soldiers on tour. Yet the shrewd Yesser had always replied that he would be the one laughing when he was a general, and they were all still privates assigned to janitorial duty. Oppen, simply nicknamed O, had been a bit of a mystery when Jay had first met him. She later found that his monosyllabic nickname had been given to him partially because of the first letter of his name, partially because of his zero social skills outside the group. A dour and silent soldier, he had nevertheless enjoyed being a part of the group and had grown especially close to Red Dwarf in those last months. And finally there was Sade, call sign Phantom 1. Jay felt a fresh wave of pain and despair wash over her at the mere thought of her commanding officer. Of all of Phantom Squadron, her small group of TIE fighter pilots, Sade was the one she missed the most of all. He'd been only a year or so older than her, a tall and strong native of her own homeworld of Corellia. When she'd first met him, she'd had trouble believing he was really a pilot at all. With his strong, handsome face, dark green eyes, and long black hair, certainly longer than military regulations, he looked more like a Halavis depiction of a smuggler or a street-savvy spice dealer. Add that to his easygoing manner and his quick, slightly crooked smile, and his charm was able to win over even the toughest of Imperial commanders. And then there was Jay. Jay Colta, a nobody pilot from a nowhere town on Corellia, now rotting in the middle of nowhere on Karulag for a crime she never committed. Strange how fate worked sometimes. She'd been brought in to serve as Sada's second in command after his previous wingman had transferred to the Imperial Marines. It had been hard work, but she'd grown to be one of the most respected pilots in her outfit because of her good luck and her skill in the cockpit. With Sade to guide her, she had helped Phantom Squadron to become one of the most efficient fighter teams in the entire Imperial Navy. During an off-duty party, Yasser, with his flair for the dramatic and helped along by an especially dramatic quantity of intoxicants, had said that because of her skill, their squad had been reborn from the ashes of our own agonizing, debilitating weakness. He'd promptly fallen out of his chair and passed out, drooling into the pristine Imperial Durasteel floor. But Sade had jumped on the comment and assigned her the call sign of Phoenix, after the extinct Corellian avian and galaxy-wide symbol of royalty, of power reborn through the heat of battle. She had gratefully accepted the handle, excited at the prospect of being far more than simply Phantom 2. She'd officially been inducted into the group, was now simply one of the many flyers. She wasn't a rookie anymore. She was family. But all good things, as they say, come to an end. 3 months ago they'd received orders for a new mission. Phantom Squadron, along with several other squads of fighter pilots, were to ship out to the remnants of the Malachor system and destroy a terrorist fleet massing there. The fleet had been responsible for raids along local hyperspace routes, stealing weapons and supplies meant for Imperial outposts on the Outer Rim. The mission brief had stated that there weren't many ships to worry about, 3 Nebulan B frigates, a couple Corellian blockade runners, and 4 squadrons of outdated Z-95 headhunter fighters. When they'd arrived, reinforced by the Acclamator Star Destroyer Triumph, they had gotten to work with their usual precision and skill. It was so easy it could hardly have been considered a battle at all. Jay and the rest of the TIEs had quickly disabled the 3 frigates and 2 blockade runners, leaving them to float powerless through space while the other squadrons took care of the headhunters. All seemed to be going well. Then, appearing from the asteroid field that was all that was left of the planet had come 16 more squadrons of Z-95s, 3 groups of old V-wing bombers, and 4 more frigates, as well as a stolen acclamator of their own. The Star Destroyer Triumph had quickly succumbed to these new forces, leaving the TIE stranded without hope for reinforcements. Jay could still see the blinding explosion as the cruiser's engines exploded into a mini supernova, and could still remember the shock and dread as she realized they were now fighting a suicide mission. With the acclamator out of the way, the new ships had quickly turned on the stranded TIE fighters. Transponder signals had flitted out left and right on Jay's readout, until only the most skilled, Phantom Squadron, were left. Red Dwarf had gone first, caught in the crossfire between Yesser's TIE Interceptor and one of the massive frigates. Emerald green turbolaser fire had clipped her wing and punctured her cockpit viewport, sending her into an uncontrollable spin. Dwarf's ship had careened wildly through space and detonated into a blue-white ball of light and debris against the hull of the enemy acclamator. Her comm cut out with one last scream. The next casualty had been Oppen, distraught by the loss of his best friend. He hadn't pulled up to avoid incoming fire, and took a proton torpedo right through the front viewport. The grim soldier's TIE had disappeared silently into the void of space with a flash of red-orange fire. The rest of Phantom Squadron had quickly followed their fellow pilots, shot down by rockets, laser blasts, or by collisions with enemy ships. Soon, the only TIE pilots left were Sade and Jay. Even as Jay watched horror-stricken, Sada's jet black interceptor had taken fire along one wing. The wing was carved away, spinning off into space while his ship careened into an out-of-control spiral. He struggled to bring the fighter out of his deadly spin, fighting with the controls as his ship's ion engine sputtered and threatened to overload. He lasted long enough to give Jay one last order: retreat and request reinforcements to finish the mission they'd been unable to complete. Then an angular Z-95 had swooped in, and Sada's ship had disappeared in a plume of flame, exhaust, and twisted durasteel. Jay's scream of denial and grief could not be heard outside the confines of her own TIE's cockpit. She had desperately screamed into her helmet's comlink, calling for backup, calling for evacuation, searching for anyone still alive. But it only succeeded in drawing enemy attention. 3 more predatory headhunters had roared to the scene, combing the wreckage of the battle for any survivors. She had quickly turned and fled, disappearing into the asteroid field that had hidden the rebel reinforcements. She'd waited there for 16 hours, her numbed and battle-shocked mind struggling to accept the fact that her only friends in the entire galaxy were dead. After 16 stunned hours, the rebels had left the area, and Jay had limped away from the battlefield, flying for almost 3 days straight to the nearest Imperial space station. She intended to honor Sada's last order and head the attack on the rebel fleet as soon as she could gather enough ships to launch a successful assault. Those butchers would not get away after what they'd done. Phantom Squadron would be avenged. But she hadn't had time to request reinforcements. She hadn't even had time to remove her flight helm. Only moments after she clambered down out of the cockpit, she'd been surrounded by stormtroopers with rifles and told that she was under arrest for treason. When she struggled, trying in vain to tell them who she was and why she needed their help, they had shot her with stun rounds and knocked her unconscious. Within 2 hours, she'd been clapped in stun cuffs and hauled before a military court. Within 4 hours, she had been dishonorably discharged. Within a day, she'd carted off to Blue Send prison and left to rot. The swift nature of her conviction was no surprise, considering the evidence that had been mounted against her. She'd been told that she had been identified as a spy, a terrorist sympathizer who had sold the Malachor battle plans to the rebels and was thus responsible for the loss of so many ships. Star Destroyer captains, Marine commanders, and even a vice admiral had testified against her, all with evidence suggesting she was a traitor. They twisted her words and used out-of-context statements to paint her as a malcontent, scheming to bring about the Empire's downfall. Jay still felt a swell of indignation at the thought. It was ridiculous. Phantom Squadron had been her entire life, and Sade, she would never dream of betraying him. He was more than just her CO, more than just a friend. It was an insult to her, an insult to her murdered friends, and an insult to the Empire itself. She was no traitor, and she never would be. She jerked her eyes open and blinked back a sudden wave of tears. To think that they were all dead now, leaving her alone. She shook her head and sniffed quietly, wiping her eyes. No, she couldn't think about that now. Thoughts like that would kill her, and here she let them. She stopped mid-thought as the trooper outside her cell put a hand to the side of his helmet and lowered his head, listening to his internal comlink. It was mildly disturbing to see the troopers carry on silent conversations over the private audio links in the helmets, but she knew her guards would tell her what was going on. They always gloated sooner or later. She watched through cautiously narrowed eyes as the trooper turned to face her. "Prisoner 27, he said to her, "orders just came through. You're going for a little field trip. You're going to stand against the wall, hands behind your head, while I lower the shield. Any bad moves and I fry you. Got it?" Crystal clear, Gorn, she sniffed, wiping her eyes one last time. This particular trooper was especially fond of beating prisoners, and she had the bruises to prove it. Not wanting confrontation, she did as she was told and stood against the wall with her hands held against the back of her head. The durasteel door of her cell made a loud creaking noise as it swung slowly open. She felt a slight flutter of fear in the pit of her stomach as Gorn slapped stun cuffs around her wrists, pinning her arms behind her back. Her execution was still 3 days away, wasn't it? Maybe the Imperials had lied to her, trying to lull her into thinking she still had time. Maybe she was going to rejoin Phantom Squad sooner than she thought. But Gorn shattered that theory when he jabbed a deactivated stun prod into the small of her back and shoved her out of the cell. He held onto her shoulder with a painfully tight grip and guided her down the hall, away from the execution chambers. Word around the base is you've got a very special visitor, 27. Jay grimaced and squirmed against the tight grip on her shoulder. Gorn let out a smug, nasty-sounding chuckle. You'll know when you see him. Then he must be even more hideous than you, Gorn, she replied with a scowl. Seeing as how your ugly faceplate is the only thing that sticks in my mind when I think Imperial. Gorn had 2 messy red streaks down the center of his helmet that reminded Jay strongly of smeared blood. Then again, knowing Gorn, he probably liked it that way. He claimed he'd gotten the idea when the last prison he guarded had broken out in riots. The riots, according to him, had only been quelled when every prisoner was killed. He swatted her across the back of the head with the butt of the stun prod and shoved her forward again. She winced, but made an effort to make no sound. With Gorn, it was wise not to show weakness. Shut your carking mouth, the trooper snapped. There's no way you're weaseling your way out of this. Not with your execution in 3 days. It would be a waste of time to try and convince you again that I'm innocent, wouldn't it? Believe it, sweetheart, Gorn growled. I've heard the same excuse over and over again. It wasn't me, they say. I wasn't even there that night. It gets more and more pathetic as the years go on. He yanked on her stun cuffs to make sure they were tight, digging the sharp edges of the restraints into the soft skin of her underarms. I've heard it all and more. It's gotten so bad that these scumbags start bawling out their sob stories the moment I walk into their cell. Jay snorted. I'm sure they say just about anything to get your stinking carcass out of their breathing area. He yanked warningly on her restraints. Care to run that by me again, prisoner? Or did your last beating not knock enough sense into you? You can beat me all you want, Gorn, she spat at him. I'm still innocent. But if using your fists on cuffed and starving prisoners makes you feel like more of a man, then just get it over with. Gorn pulled his fist back for a punch, a snarl coming over his calm set. Jay raised her chin and tightened her jaw, preparing for the inevitable blow that would no doubt knock her off her feet. Before the blow could fall, someone caught Gorn's wrist. Straighten up, 5-2, came the accented, gravelly voice of a clone trooper, or I'll report you to Lewin for roughing up the prisoners. Gorn growled, his white helmet nodding toward Jay. This big mouth scum doesn't deserve any better. The clone, dressed in the white and brown of the local legion and wearing the red shoulder pad of a captain, grabbed Jay roughly by the shoulder. That may be, but I think I'll take the prisoner from here. We don't want the general punishing you for bringing our guest bad merchandise. Piss off, Tamar, Gorn snapped, waving his stun prod for emphasis. Everyone knows you've got a soft spot for the inmates. Especially the pretty ones. You clones are too spineless for your own good. Is that so? Well, in case you hadn't noticed, I'm also a captain, Tamar barked, drawing his pistol and tapping the barrel against his red shoulder pad. And I have no worries about shooting a lowly private like you for insubordination. So you can take that stun prod of yours and shove it up your ass for all I care. He took a threatening step forward, his voice growling out like the snarl of a predatory Vorn tiger. So that means you will straighten up, mind your manners, and return to your bloody post, 5-2. That sure shut Gorn up. The two troopers stood in silence for a few moments, staring each other down with twin glares that could each have frozen Karulak sun. But even a barb as awful as Gorn couldn't stand up under the narrow-eyed glare of a veteran clone trooper. Gorn stiffly saluted, snapping his fist to his chest, then turned sharply and stalked down the hall in the opposite direction. He waved his stun prod at a few prisoners as he passed and shouted, "What the hell were you looking at? You want me to come in there?" As soon as he was out of earshot, Jay sighed in relief and let the tension slowly ease from her body. Her clenched fists relaxed, as did her gritted teeth. Nice timing as always, Tam. The clone captain deftly spun his pistol around his trigger finger before holstering it with a flourish. His face was still drawn down in a dark scowl. Any day I get to crack down on Gorn is a good day in my book. The man's a menace. Come on. They set off slowly down the hall, looking like any other captain escorting a prisoner to another part of the base. Tamar's firm hand on her shoulder guided her deeper into the prison, past stormtrooper guards and black-clad technicians. She even saw an officer or two milling about and looking nervous. There must be a dignitary performing an inspection or something. Sorry I have to let him beat up on you occasionally. Tamar's voice was almost too quiet to hear, but the regret in his tone was unmistakable. Jay shrugged, wincing as her sore muscle sent another dull ache down her spine. If you didn't, it would be pretty obvious that you were watching out for me. I can't be the only prisoner who walks around without bruises. I understand, Tam. He grunted, but said nothing. She watched as they passed by another stiff-looking officer who was nervously adjusting the collar of his pressed uniform. Something definitely had the locals riled up. She cocked her head, not able to look over her shoulder at her clone friend. Just who was this visitor of mine that you guys keep talking about? Tamar shrugged. No clue? Rumors are going around the base, of course, but no one's saying anything with certainty. Some Imperial tough guy, maybe. Probably with intelligence. Why are they making such a big deal out of me? Jay hissed. She felt all the old indignation rising up in her gut once more. I didn't do anything. Even if I did, it was a routine counterinsurgency operation. There's nothing special there. I still can't give you any answers, Jay, he said. He squeezed her shoulder. Not yet. All I can say is that I'm still trying, discreetly, mind you, to get your execution delayed again. Former ARC troopers may not have any rights, but I have friends in low places who have friends in high places. Jay sighed and gave him a slow nod. I know. And even if we don't get the delay, I appreciate everything you've done for me. Even if we don't, Tamar echoed darkly, I have a backup plan. What? Just some old friends who happen to be in the neighborhood. The old clone then fell silent. It was obvious he didn't want to say any more. They turned another corner, and Jay suddenly recognized where they were. They were standing at the head of a long corridor framed by tall, whitewashed Durasteel doors on either side. Each door was marked with the holographic sign reading Air 01 to Air 09. Jay shuddered in spite of herself. Air stood for Active Interrogation Room. This was the part of the prison that the prisoners referred to as the Nightmare Block. Those unfortunate few that had entered these pristine white doors never emerged the same again. She'd been lucky enough to never see this wing of the prison before. It looked like that luck had finally run out. She could hear no sound from the other sides of the interrogation room doors. That meant they were either empty, soundproofed, or the occupants of the rooms were in no condition to speak. She didn't know which was more terrifying. Tam. The old clone tightened his grip on her shoulder. I'm sorry, Jay, but I have my orders. The tall door to Air 03 swung open. Jay tried to back away, feeling a small worm of fear turn in her gut, but Tamar's firm grip kept her moving forward. As they crossed the threshold, he whispered, "Forgive me." The room behind the door was filled with a white-hot, blinding light that obscured the world and left Jay's head spinning. She blinked a few times, her eyes struggling to adjust to the sudden change. But she stopped cold when she heard the sound that was coming from the room, harsh, wheezing, mechanical breath that sounded like the breathing of death itself. That single sound was known across the galaxy, as was the infamous Imperial to whom it belonged. Tamar, who was not blinded as Jay was, could see her visitor perfectly. She felt him tense up behind her. The prisoner, as you requested, my lord, he said, sounding just as shocked as Jay was. Very good, Captain, Darth Vader replied in his deep, booming voice. He gestured with a large gloved hand. You may leave. If I may, Tamar said, sounding nervous for the first time since Jay had met him. I would like to stay to ensure the prisoner's security. After all, a breakout would look terrible on the quarterly reports, and the general. Do you believe me incapable of preventing a single prisoner's escape, Captain? Tammer stiffened behind her, his voice tight. Not at all, sir, but we must follow protocol. Protocol does not concern me, Captain. Vader waved a hand, dismissing the statement. You may leave. Now. Tammer knew an order when he heard one, and at his core he was still an Imperial soldier. So he snapped to attention, saluted, then turned and left the room without another word. The door swung shut with a resounding boom behind him. Jay was left alone with the Dark Lord. Vader stared at the closed door for a moment, taking in a long, slow breath. It came hissing back out of his mask in a slow, echoing exhale. Then, with a single heavy boot step, the black-clad Colossus turned to Jay. He inclined his helmeted head in greeting. Captain Colta, a pleasure to finally make your acquaintance. She said nothing. You won't need those. The Dark Lord gestured with a shadowy hand, and there was a deep rumble in the air, like distant thunder rolling across the sky. Heavy pressure settled over Jay's wrist for a moment. Then she felt her electroshock binders click off and fall to the floor with a clatter. She still didn't speak. She couldn't speak. Her mind was still struggling to catch up to where she was. She was standing alone, weaponless, and completely vulnerable in a small Duracrete room with the most feared being in the galaxy save for the Emperor himself. She could only guess why she was still alive. From what she had heard, Vader had a proclivity for choking people to death without even touching them. He could tear starships from the sky and bat blaster bolts from the air with nothing more than his bare hand. And now he was here, staring at her. Jay glanced down at her now free wrists, trembling from far more than just the cold air of the interrogation room. She rubbed her palms as she looked up into Vader's infamous death mask of a helmet and tried her best not to flinch. Hey, aren't you afraid I'll attack you? Or try to escape? Vader didn't move. Captain, if I had any worries about my personal safety, or the security of this room, you would have been dead before you passed through the door. Jay's eyebrows twisted up slightly in surprise. Her voice was a small, choked squeak. Oh. Vader gestured to the chair on her side of the table. It slid out and pointed toward her as if manipulated by invisible hands. Sit. Jay found herself, through fear or some subliminal mind trick, unable to resist. She sat in the chair, trembling harshly. She folded her hands in her lap, unconsciously sitting at attention like she would for a superior officer. It didn't help her trembling. If anything, it only made it all that easier to notice. Vader leaned forward, towering over her like a monolith of black cloth, leather, and metal. The persistent wheeze-sigh repetition of his breathing made Jay flinch every few seconds and hunch her shoulders as if preparing to take a blow from some unseen assailant. She hoped that Vader couldn't sense just how frightened she was. He might use that to his advantage. When he spoke, his voice was low and devoid of any emotion. I assume you understand I am not here to simply visit death row inmates. You want to know about the Malachor mission? Yes. Vader finally leaned back, still scrutinizing her with that unseen, masked gaze. Countless officers have informed me that you are guilty of treason, that you are a spy within the Navy, and that you are leaking information to insurgent Imperial subjects. Jay scowled. That's what they keep telling me, too. Vader stood to his full height again. I see that, like myself, you are still convinced of your innocence. I keep telling people. Jay stopped mid-sentence, her mouth falling open in shock. Words failed her for a moment, until she managed to wrench out a strangled, "What? You don't think I did it?" The Dark Lord shook his head. No. I do not believe you ultimately responsible for the failure of the Malachor counterinsurgency. Jay's head spun with relief. After all this drama, she was really going to be fine. With a pardon and a recommendation from Lord Vader himself, her execution would be cancelled. She would be out of prison, and probably promoted by the end of the week. It was all going to be all right. What I wish to know, Vader continued, is who paid you to deliberately sabotage the mission. Her small bubble of relief exploded. What? Jay suddenly felt her face slammed hard against the Durasteel tabletop. She heard a sharp crack, and pain and adrenaline suddenly coursed through her body. She cried out and clapped her hands over her suddenly bloodied nose. "Do not lie to me, Captain." Vader's voice carried a dangerous tension. He had not moved the entire time. Jay wiped blood from her nose and tried to look unfazed. To some extent, she was. She was a fighter pilot, and she had received far worse wounds in the cockpit of her TIE Interceptor. Still, she hadn't expected her face to be smashed against the table by someone she didn't know was there. But there was no one there, she knew. It was just her and Vader. There was silence in the room, broken only by Vader's mechanized breathing. When she said nothing, he tilted his head down to stare at her, the bottomless glare of his death's head face mask seeming to sink down into her very soul. She squirmed, but found that she could not rise from her chair no matter how hard she struggled. The rumble had returned, and she knew now it wasn't thunder. "I can see every secret within your mind, Captain Coulter. You cannot hide your accomplice from me for long. Your fate will be much more bearable if you only provide me with a name." "I don't know what you're talking about," Jay cried, feeling blood drip into her cupped hands. "I've never sabotaged any mission, let alone been paid for it." She cursed and said, "You don't even have any proof." "Proof?" Vader stepped away and clasped his hands behind his back. "The day after your failure at Malachor, 100,000 credits were transferred to your private account on Corellia. Coincidence? I never got any money." Her blood ran, if possible, even colder. That was why she was here. Someone had set her up. You were likely unaware of the transfer because you were imprisoned the moment you returned to Imperial space, 2 days later. He took a single breath. "We will find your accomplice, but I am offering you a full pardon if you simply give me a name and location now." Jay squeezed her eyes shut, feeling almost dizzy with disbelief. "I don't know what you're talking about." A slow wee sigh from Vader's respirator. "Then you and I are going to be here for a very long time, Captain." Jay cried out as invisible fingers gripped the back of her head, tugging hard at her hair, and slammed her face into the durasteel tabletop again. She was held there, ground hard against the surface until blood from her nose smeared her face and the tabletop. Her throat swelled closed, as if gripped by invisible hands. She pawed at her throat, trying to suck in breath, but found that no matter how desperately she tried, she could not breathe. Through it all, Vader only stared at her. Then, as suddenly as the attack began, she was released again. The pressure vanished from the back of her head and the invisible fingers released her throat. She rocked back in her chair, gasping for breath as tears streamed down her face. Vader stared down at her for a long time before speaking again. "Now, Captain, tell me about Malachor." Chapter 4. The Plan. Several hours later, Vader swept out of the room with a loud mechanical wheeze. General Loom jumped forward and fell into step with the Dark Lord. Over his shoulder he saw the prisoner, 26 if memory served, slumped over the durasteel interrogation table. Blood stained the table, and the white duracrete beneath, running in sluggish rivulets down her limp arms. If she was breathing, he could not tell from this distance. He gulped and hurried after Vader, eager to leave the scene of the Dark Lord's wrath behind. "Well?" he asked, struggling to keep up with Vader's impressive speed. "Did she give up a name?" "Her resistance to my interrogation is impressive," the Dark Lord boomed. "But she will not hold out much longer. I want her questioned daily by 2 separate interrogation droids, one every 3 hours. Use truth serums and physical persuasion as necessary. Her execution will be delayed until further notice." "But my lord," Lewin said, "her death has already been delayed several times, and another." "It will be delayed until I give the order for her to die," Vader interrupted forcefully. "Am I understood?" "Why, yes, my lord," Lewin backed down without further comment. "Good. I am returning to Coruscant tonight on urgent business for the Emperor. I want weekly reports of this prisoner's status. If she divulges the name of her accomplice, I wish to know immediately." "Of course, Lord Vader." "Are my pilot and co-pilot waiting?" Vader boomed as he gestured for the exit door to open. He seemed to pay the torrential rain no attention. The rain lashed against his armor, and his cape billowed out around him as he stepped outside, but he strode forward as resolutely as ever. Around him, the storm seemed to only be growing worse. "They are waiting on the landing pad as we speak, my lord." "Good." The black-clad Titan set off across the facility at a brisk pace that Lewin found difficult to match. A few moments later, they approached the two pilots on the landing pad, waiting obediently as per their orders. The men were protected from the rain by the large mass of the ship behind them, and they both shuffled nervously from foot to foot as Vader approached. Lewin did not envy them, being in Vader's direct attention after an obviously frustrating interrogation session. The Dark Lord stopped in front of them and placed his hands on his hips. "Are you the pilot and co-pilot of my shuttle?" The two saluted stiffly. "Yes, my lord," the pilot said. "We took you down this morning." The Dark Lord looked between the two for a moment, then said, "Then can you explain why you chose to reveal such rebellious thoughts when you clearly knew I was aboard?" Both men frowned in confusion, the pilot going suddenly pale. Sir, I don't know." He broke off and coughed, rubbing his throat with the gloved hand. He coughed again as Vader took a single step closer, cape billowing around his armored boots. The Dark Lord leaned forward, towering over him as the man gagged and began to gasp for air. "I could sense every thought that passed through your mind as you piloted this ship," Vader said, his voice a low grumble. "You cannot hide your contempt for my presence here, or your growing dissatisfaction with the Empire's ways. Do you wish to resign? To leave? Perhaps to rebel?" The man sputtered and frantically shook his head, going slightly purple. His eyes were all but popping out of his head now. As the torture continued, Lewin began to hear a strange noise over the sound of the rain. "Not thunder? Something else." "I have no need for malcontents and dissidents, Captain." Vader leaned back and shook his helmeted head in disgust. The man fell to the ground with a gurgle, his feet twitching. After a few moments, he fell completely still. The Sith Lord prodded the body with the tip of his armored boot, then murmured, "Within the Empire, resignation is adjunct, not a privilege." Vader turned to the co-pilot and raised a great gloved hand, clenching it into a fist. The man instantly began to wheeze and hold his throat like his companion, and again, Lewin heard that same low rumble over the air, like the dying roll of distant thunder. Please," the man cried out. I have a wife. And a kid." "Then your failure is complete, private. To detest the ways of the government that supports your family. I am truly disappointed." He made a fist, and the man's neck snapped with a series of wet crunches. Lewin's eyes were wide with shock as he glanced at Vader, to the two dead men in front of him, then back to Vader. "Is there?" He cleared his throat and tried again. "Is there anything else you wish of me, my lord?" "No," Vader said, striding past the stormtroopers who had appeared to drag the bodies away. Two more pilots jumped to take their newfound positions as the Dark Lord's escort. "But I want the name of Colter's accomplice." Lewin nodded emphatically. "Of course, Lord Vader." Vader nodded and strode up the ramp into the ship. "Ensure my orders are obeyed, General Lewin. Do not make me return to your prison." Karulag, Javilian Forest. The next day dawned dreary and damp. Thankfully, the moist air and thick cloud cover of the day before had shielded the view of Voya's entry burn, allowing them to slip unnoticed into the lower atmosphere. The ship was now far from the TIE fighter sentries and safely hidden in the back forest several miles from the complex. The stormtroopers outside the fortress were currently having a hard time walking in the mud and were complaining about the lack of real roads this far into the mountains. Their complaints fell on mostly deaf ears, but Rain was listening intently. Boots sticking in the mud, the quiet, analytical part of his mind whispered, "That'll decrease their mobility, make them easier to pick off." But it would also decrease Hedon's mobility, as he would be the one infiltrating the outpost. A fully armored Mandalorian was almost twice as heavy as a stormtrooper, so Hedon would be even slower. That made the mud a double-edged sword, and a potential problem they'd need to keep an eye on. Fully dressed in his Beskar combat armor, Rain was currently situated on the sturdy branch of one of the forest's massive trees. The forest only 30 feet beyond had been leveled, cleared away long ago when the base was still being built. It was supposed to give the base a kill zone for any escaping prisoners. Even if someone miraculously made it out, there would be no cover outside the walls. Manned turrets on the walls or the stormtrooper guard could then mow down the escapee with ease. Rain could already see more than one muddy skeleton sprawled across the ground below. He hunched lower and increased magnification on his helmet's HUD with the blink of an eye, studying the outpost for weaknesses. Blue Sin Prison Complex was a collection of drab, slate-gray buildings with little or no windows, spread out across a small hill. The entire complex stretched out in a rough circle with maybe a half-mile radius. He could easily pick out the mess hall, the command center, the comm relay, and the shipyards that housed the local garrison of TIE fighters. All were fairly spread out so that a single missile strike wouldn't take out all the important parts of the facility. Smart. It was big as prison facilities went, and Rain was certain there weren't holding cells in all those buildings. This had been cause for some initial concern, but some subtle hollow-net investigation had quickly provided the answer. Blue Sin was a large but narrowly focused army company giving funding to military prisons and correctional facilities. A cursory examination of the outpost's quarterly report shed further light on the inner workings of the prison, suggesting that it was also a hotspot for experimental interrogation. They built the Empire for all kinds of related equipment, including electroshock binders, hallucinogens for IV injections, and lots of truth serum. The base was using its prisoners as lab rats for experimental torture techniques. Rain couldn't help but admire the cunning plan, even if he was simultaneously disgusted by it. No one really cared about the rights of convicted criminals these days, and if all went as the Imperials wanted it, no one would even know any of them were here. The most important structure, the landing pad, was situated at the highest point of the hill. The rest of the buildings were roughly clustered around it, like ancient villages arrayed around a temple. Obviously, Blue Sin Naval Base was highly dependent on outside support, despite its top-secret classification. If he had to bring Void into pick heading up, that was where he'd have to go. But it wasn't going to be easy. The landing pad was covered from all conceivable directions by 5 computer-guided turbolaser turrets, built into boxy towers along the perimeter wall. They tracked back and forth even now, scanning the skies for potential threats. More than one shot from those babies could blast a transport like Void to bits. But he zoomed in closer on the troopers who were standing a good distance from the entrance. Stupidly, they were gathered around a fuel pod, warming themselves from the heat the pod gave off as it supplied power to one of the turbolaser towers above them. It was a weakness he could very easily exploit. A single well-placed sniper bolt would blow the pod, take out the troopers near it, and provide a big enough distraction for Vader to cut his way through the thick boundary wall further down the barrier without interference. He was almost pleased for once at Imperial stupidity. They had single-handedly provided him with an entrance plan. Now what about a way out? When the Imperials noticed Vader's presence, they would undoubtedly lock down the gate and guard any forced entry points. He frowned inside his helmet, keeping a close eye on the movements of the troopers. Flying Void into the facility was out of the question. She would be shot down before she made it past the northern perimeter. And Vader couldn't carry his own weight and that of the bounty on his jetpack alone, even with his fancy new FLT-23 model. So what to do? He examined the edge of the walls. The rest of the fuel pods were too far out of range to take out with the sniper rifle. But, he suddenly thought, those are just the fuel pods. There's got to be an intake station somewhere in the base that supplies coolant fluid to all the operational turrets. Otherwise they'd overheat and explode. He followed the large fuel pipes running from the closest turret. They twisted behind buildings, around stationary spotlights, and through the legs of guard towers. They even dipped underground in one place. He paused and zoomed in even further on the place where they disappeared under the ground. It looked like it was part of the well-guarded command center. If the coolant intake station was under that building, Vader could fight his way in, take out the station, and overload the turrets. The turrets would go pop, probably a much bigger sound, but pop was all he could think of, and instantly shut down. Rain can fly void into the facility to pick up Vader and the bounty, then blast away from Karulak free as a bird. He nodded and drew back on the trunk, out of sight of any watchful Imperials. It wasn't the best plan, and he didn't enjoy making things up on the fly, but it was very possible. He just hoped Sheen would be able to pull it off. Vader squeezed through the gap in the security door, rifle held at the ready. Death row was not a pretty sight. Dirty cell bars flanked by dirty walls over a dirty floor illuminated by dirty light. Vaden's lip curled in disgust as he stepped around a large puddle of off-color liquid. The prisoners were all either cowering at the back of their cells or pressed up against the bars, watching the proceedings with contempt. One of the latter, a muscled behemoth decorated with tattoos, spat at him as he passed. "Hey, Buckethead," he called out. "Come to spring one of us?" "You can rot in there," Vaden replied, scowling at the man's use of the derogatory term Buckethead. "I'm not here for any of you. I have an appointment with the good general." Hearing this, a few of the inmates cheered and called out, "Go get him, Buckethead." Vaden ignored them all. Halfway down the hall, however, he paused outside the cell of one prisoner who was cowering in the back, crying. That voice almost seemed familiar. He found his mind drifting back to research and reports featuring his target. A cursory scan with his HUD confirmed the man's identity. General Lewin in the flesh. "General Lewin," he asked with mock kindness, "is that you, Vodka?" The general whipped around, a small field pistol in his right hand. Vaden's instincts kicked in, and he instantly raised his rifle and shot the back of Lewin's hand. The general screamed and collapsed, curling into a ball and cradling his burned and bleeding arm. The field pistol clattered to the ground. Vaden kicked the door in, weapon pointed squarely at Lewin's head. The general was worth more alive, but if he tried to pull anything else, Vaden would fry him anyway. Reward money wasn't any good if a hunter was dead. "On your feet," Vaden growled, putting a hand under the general's arm and hauling him up. "King Latu sends his regards." Lewin spat in Vaden's face in a last-ditch attempt at defiance. Vaden didn't flinch. A half-second later, the systems in his helmet's HUD sent an electrical charge across the visor, evaporating the spittle in a small puff of smoke and leaving his vision clear. He was about to move out of the cell when his motion tracker showed movement behind him. His helmet's 360-degree vision picked up a man-sized shadow darting closer. Vaden caught a glimpse of white armor and a black undersuit, as well as twin pistols drawn and primed to fire. Will these imps never learn? He thought in exasperation. He spun and pointed his rifle at the stormtrooper that had managed to creep right up behind him. "Stop right there if you want to live." The first thing that struck him was the trooper's stylized helmet, a unique amalgamation of old Clone Wars era gear and more modern stormtrooper tech. The trooper also had a pistol in each hand, both aimed squarely at Vaden's forehead. They stayed there, weapons aimed directly at each other's faces, for what seemed like an eternity. "Go ahead," Vaden finally said, tightening his finger on the firing stud. "Shoot, if you think you can pull it off before I do." "Now why would I do that?" the trooper said, "when I was the one who called you here in the first place?" Vaden paused, and his pistol barrel lowered the slightest bit. "Tamer." The old clone laughed and holstered his pistols, raising his hands as a sign of peace. "Alive and kicking. It's good to see you too, Vaden." "Is that Tam?" Rain said excitedly over the comlink. "You didn't say Tam was your contact." Vaden lowered his weapon, letting his guard down momentarily. This was no run-of-the-mill Imperial white job, but an old friend. He leaned forward and embraced the trooper with a smile. When Loon tried to use the distraction to run, Vaden simply stuck his foot out and tripped him. "Sorry about the rifle," the bounty hunter said as he pulled Lewin back to his feet. "I didn't know who you were." "Don't bother with it," Tamer said. He turned his gaze to Lewin, scrutinizing the cowering man with obvious distaste. "I see you found the Ahuchuan we call a general around here." "It took a bit of a chase," Vheden said, tightening his grip on Lewin's arm as the man tried to pull away again. But yeah, I've got him. You, Lewin cried, pointing his good hand at Tamar. You're the one who's been leaking information to these bounty hunters. I'll make sure you're court-martialed, arrested, executed. Lord Vader himself will know of your treachery against the Empire, you disloyal, unfaithful dog. In fact, may I? Tamar asked, indicating Lewin. Vheden shrugged. Be my guest. Tamar cocked his fist back and punched the general square in the jaw. The general stumbled, fell to the ground, and started crying all over again. Thanks, Tamar said, rubbing his knuckles. I've wanted to do that for a very long time. With a grunt, Vheden hauled the blubbering Imperial back to his feet again. My pleasure. There was a brief moment of silence, during which another explosion went off somewhere outside the building. No one but Lewin paid it any attention. Instead, Vheden regarded Tamar's armor, eyes lingering on the red pauldron plate that adorned his right shoulder. So, you made full captain, eh? Congratulations. I knew you had it in you. Tamar shrugged. The rank has its ups and downs. As a clone, I get no respect from my underlings and my superiors. Well, they didn't like me from the beginning. But on the upside, I have leverage over 3/4 of the low-level and mid-level officers here. At Blue Sand, Tamar is effectively the puppet master. You know there'll always be a place for you back on Mandalore if you want it. Tamar suddenly hesitated. Yeah? What's wrong? The old clone awkwardly shifted his weight from foot to foot and quietly said, Vheden, I have a favor to ask you. For old time's sake. Vheden frowned. He didn't like where this conversation was suddenly headed. What? It'll be easier to show you. Follow me. The clone gestured to follow, and Vheden, after some initial hesitation, shrugged and pulled a pair of binders from his belt. Yanking Lewin's arms behind his back, he cuffed the general's arms together and hissed, Looks like we're going for a bit of a detour. You should be thankful that you will get to see your precious base one last time. Lewin's only response was a terrified whimper. Then they set off down the dark, dank hallway. The general's boots dragged through the puddles that had collected on the floor as the man tried his best to resist. When he grew fed up with the defiance, Vheden sighed, drew his pistol, and shot the man in the back with a low-energy stun bolt, not enough to knock him out, but more than enough to get him moving. I'll hit you with a real one next time if you don't move your feet, Vheden growled. Last warning. The general reluctantly began walking. Good boy. Vheden shoved Lewin in front of him, sticking the pistol in his back. Now behave and you'll have a few more hours of peace before you're in any real trouble. They walked on in silence, listening to the explosions and the muffled din of battle outside. Rain was thankfully still keeping everyone busy in the courtyard. It was some time before Tamar spoke again. To tell the truth, the old clone said, I wasn't completely sure you remembered me. Sure I do, the teen replied. We Mandoys smuggle clones out of the military all the time, but it's not often that we try and smuggle someone back into the Empire. Skirata still misses you, by the way. Tamar chuckled. Sentimental old Shabur. Tell him I send my regards, would you? Vheden nodded. In the meantime, what's this favor you want me to do? I don't normally agree to things without knowing all the information beforehand. Tamar paused by a cell and gestured at it with a weary sigh. See for yourself. Propped up against the back wall was a woman about Veden's age, battered and unconscious. Her face was covered in purple-black bruises and her right eye was swelled completely shut. Long brown hair fell down over her eyes in a messy curtain, partially obscuring her features. Blood stained her face and neck, and she was sprawled across the floor like she hadn't moved since the guards threw her back into custody. Vheden frowned behind his helmet faceplate. Who was she? She didn't look overly threatening. If anything, she looked like a perfectly normal young woman save for the obvious injuries. But this was a maximum security facility. What could she possibly have done to land in this hellhole? She can't stay here, Tamar said, sympathy evident in his voice. Vheden turned back to him with a frown. This was a surprising request coming from the old clone. And if there was one thing he hated, it was surprises in the middle of carefully planned operations. You want me to break her out? I'm not normally one to break Spring People Prison, but I need her gone. She's scheduled for daily torture, then execution. Vader gazed around him with a skeptical eyebrow raised, though Tamara couldn't see it. Another explosion went off somewhere in the distance, and the ground rumbled beneath their boots, shaking small chunks of duracrete loose from the ceiling. That would be the red number 2 collapsing, Rain reported. This is just a hunch, Vader said, but I think she'll be fine for a few months more. This place won't be able to administer execution services for a while. Please? Tamara pleaded. She's here on false charges. She's innocent. Now that was interesting, and it made Hedden finally hesitate. Taking this woman with him would be risky, maybe even fatal. Loon was doing everything he could to hinder their progress already, and this woman would undoubtedly slow them down even more. He had no time for Arudia civilians on a mission like this. But if the woman was truly innocent, she didn't deserve to be in this prison cell. Unsurprisingly, the Empire had once again overlooked justice in order to further its own goals. That was a predicament he could sympathize with. Would he have to sacrifice his mission to get her out? He couldn't do that. He wouldn't do that. He had been hired to capture Lewin, and he wasn't going to let the general escape because of one falsely incarcerated Imperial. But at the same time, he couldn't leave her to die here. If she was falsely accused, she deserved better than to rot in prison before a painful execution. And he wasn't the kind of man who could walk away and let innocent people die when there was something he could do about it. He eventually sighed out a weary curse. All right, you hit me in my soft spot. I'll take her with me. But you have to help get us out of here. I can't carry her and make sure Lewin behaves at the same time. Thank you, Hedden, Tamara sighed. I owe you one. You don't owe me anything. Let's just get her out of here and be on our way. Tamara tried typing in the code to unlock the doors. The ray shields were down, but the doors were still locked. When he entered the code, all he got was a very unsatisfying buzz. He frowned, then typed the code in again. The door still didn't budge. The old clone cursed and slammed his palm against the controls, again to no avail. Damn it, he snapped. Security lockdown secured the doors. He turned to Hedden and gestured to the heavy bars. Would you mind? Hedden nodded and leveled his pistol at the cell door's hinges. He fired 3 times, once at each hinge, and the door fell to the ground with a loud clang. Tamara quickly stepped inside and scooped the unconscious woman into his arms. Come on, he said. We'll have to hurry if we want to make it to the gate. I've got another plan, Hedden interjected. All we have to do is get outside. Okay, Tamara said. Can you carry her? Hedden nodded and took the unconscious woman while Tamara drew his pistols. I'll take point, the old clone said. We'll be right behind you. I won't, Lewin muttered stubbornly. He dug his soiled Imperial boots into the floor and scowled at them. Since Hedden had his hands full carrying the woman, Tamara took the initiative and drove the butt of one of his pistols into the side of the Imperial skull. Lewin quickly grew more cooperative. What exactly is this plan you've got cooked up? Tamara said as they set off toward the exit. I hope it doesn't involve you blowing up this entire facility. That would look pretty bad on my report. Hedden shook his head. A while ago, I took out the coolant intake system powering the turrets. If all went well, the turrets are currently overheating, leaving the skies clear. Raim's going to come in and pick us up in my ship. So that's what that first explosion was. Tamara nodded, clearing the room before saying, all right, come on through. Raim. Hedden triggered his comm as he kicked Lewin in the backside, pushing him through the gap in the door. I need you to come pick us up. We don't have much time. Already here, he replied. I made this easy on you and sat down on the landing pad. I'm keeping the Imperials at bay with Voya's turret system, but I can't stay for long. Hedden nodded and relayed the message to Tamara. The clone captain was already pressed into cover by the doorway, pistols at the ready. The clone nodded at the information and said, Your ship's right there, but, well, if it's not too much trouble, we need to make sure it looks like I'm not actually helping you. Vader understood his concern. If the security cameras scattered around the prison perimeter showed Tamara helping them escape, another execution would soon be in order. The cams inside had been taken out by the damage to the base. Raim had knocked out the building's power generator with a well-placed sniper bolt, but outside was just as active as ever. All Tamara knew was military life. Vaden could respect his desire to stay where he was. Still, he felt compelled to give the old clone a chance. "Are you sure you don't want to come with us?" he asked. "Scarada would be overjoyed to have you back." "And leave my post just when things got interesting." Tamara shook his head. "Nah, I'll stick it out with the Empire for a while longer. But I'll watch the HoloNet intently for news on you, Vaden. The way you attacked this outpost, that was amazing. Worthy of Fett himself." "I always aim to please." Vaden nodded toward the unconscious woman in his arms. "And any special requests for her?" Tamara glanced at the woman and his voice softened. "Just make sure she's okay. Help her to start her life over. This'll be hard on her, but I'm sure she'll make it." "She means a lot to you." Tamara chuckled. "Old clones like me don't make many friends in the Empire. I think it's our charming personalities. But she turned out to be a pretty good friend to an old cat hound like me. She deserves this." Heard and understood. "I guess I'll see you around." "Not if I can help it," Tamara said, only half joking. "It's not good for an up-and-coming officer like me to have connections to a bounty hunter such as yourself. No offense." "None taken," Vaden said with a smile. "Good luck, Tamara." "And to you, Cheen," Tamara replied before settling into a firing position, his pistols held at arm's length. "In the meantime, I'll give you a 5-second head start." Vaden nodded, shoved Loon out in front of him, and growled, "If I were you, Imperial, I'd head for the ship. Tamara will be shooting to kill." What? Have to make it look convincing, don't I?" Tamara said. 5, 4, 3. Loon gulped, then sprinted as fast as he could towards Void, which was resting on the landing pad, ready for immediate takeoff. Vaden nodded in farewell to the clone, then sprinted out into the open as well. You've picked up an extra one, Cheen," Raim said a few moments later, standing on Void's entrance ramp. "I don't know if you remember, but the contract said..." He was cut off as Tamara planted 2 blaster bolts into the durasteel right next to his head. "Holy," Raim hopped away, his eyes wide. "What was that?" "Long story," Vaden grunted, shoving Lewin up the ramp. "Tamara is providing us with permission to take off." "Well, you don't have to enjoy it so much," Raim yelled at Tamara. He then recoiled as another bolt exploded next to his head. The old clone was standing about 100 meters from the ship, unloading his pistols at them as they fled. "Mandalorian scum," he shouted at them. "Fear effect." Raim shook his head in disbelief. "He's really pouring it on, isn't he?" "Raim," Vaden snapped. "We need to leave. Now." "Oh, right?" He broke and ran back toward the cockpit. Vaden shoved Lewin into a nearby side room. The cramped compartment was filled with durasteel cages for bounty storage. Vaden gestured at an open one and snarled, "And you get, General. No time to stand on ceremony." Loom stared at the cages with wide eyes. "You must be joking." "I'm not much of a joker. Get in or I'll put you in." Loom stared at him, then grudgingly crawled into the cage and slammed the door shut behind him. Vaden, adjusting his hold on the woman in his arms, reached over and punched a button on the wall. The space between the bars lit up with the shimmering light of a force field that would keep the prisoner safely pinned in. Convinced his quarry was secure, Vaden carried the unconscious woman into the sleeping quarters, where he secured her in rudimentary crash webbing. He triple-checked that she wasn't going to bounce free, then sprinted for the cockpit. He had to move carefully since the ship was already lifting off and the deck was shaking beneath his boots. He keyed open the door to the cockpit to find Raim sitting in the co-pilot seat, his helmet resting on the floor next to him. He was typing in course corrections and setting up the navigational computer as the autopilot blasted them away from the planet. After a few moments, the pop of blaster fire ricocheting against the hull faded away. "How are we coming along?" Vader asked him. "We have no TIE fighter reinforcements incoming. The ship cams showed that Lewin's still in the cages. The flight deck seems to be clean of any other Imperial life, and we're well on our way out of here." Rhames sighed and leaned back in his chair. "And with comms knocked out at Blue Send, it'll be at least a few hours until they can report the attack. I'd say we're in the clear." Vaden let out a deep breath, his shoulders slumping in relief. "That's good to hear. Nice work out there." Rhames let out an exhausted chuckle. "And to you, Vod. So who the hell is the girl?" "Long story. I'll tell you when we're away from this soak-hole. When we get back to Keldave, drinks are on you. And believe me, I'm going to need them. Deal? Let's go and collect our money, then head back home." He checked the ship's sensors and found them more than satisfactory. No Imperials were flying to intercept them. The ones that were moving were headed down to the planet's surface, probably to the now ruined Blue Send outpost. Satisfied that they were unseen, he pulled back a lever after the Navi computer signaled that the coordinates were set. The ship rumbled and shook. Then the stars blurred to streaks and exploded into the whirling blue-white tunnel of hyperspace. Vaden waited a few moments, then relaxed against the pilot seat. He slowly removed his helmet and rubbed his tired, aching eyes. After taking a moment to regain his composure, he eyed what remained of his equipment. Parts of his armor were burned and still red-hot from absorbing rifle fire. His combat suit was charred and torn, and he'd received a pretty nasty blaster burn to his shoulder. Otherwise, he was fine. He would bandage up his shoulder a little later. For now, he just sat back in his seat and closed his eyes. "That's it," he thought as he felt sleep tug at his senses. Mission accomplished. Chapter 8. The Girl. Coordinates unknown. Hyperspace tunnel en route to Nar Shaddaa. Jay's head hurt. That was the first thing she remembered as the infinite black of unconsciousness peeled away to reveal a blurry gray field of vision. She blinked and moaned, trying to press a hand to her pounding head. Her hand didn't move, nor did her arm. She tried again, but found her arm just as limp and lifeless as before. "Oh no," had Vader broken in while interrogating her. She couldn't remember. She tried moving her other arm and found it just as unresponsive. Attempting to sit up was met with the same failure. She blinked, then winced as a splitting pain erupted in her head. What the hell? She grimaced as she forced her eyelids to open and tried to focus on the world around her. As her blurry vision resolved and became clearer, her worry quickly turned into confusion. This isn't the prison. Her voice was barely a whisper, but it seemed very loud to her ears. Where am I? She looked around, thankfully able to slowly move her head from side to side. Was she in the execution room already? Just how long had she been unconscious? As she looked down at her arms, she realized she wasn't restrained with the usual binders or electroshock shackles. Instead, she was held to an uncomfortable cot by a simple crash webbing. It took a few painful moments to unhook herself from the webbing. Taking a deep breath, she slowly sat up and rubbed her aching forehead. Thankfully, it didn't seem like anything was broken. She was battered, bruised, bloodied, and sore all over, but she was alive. Alive. The word seemed strange to her, especially given the events of the past few days. Not many people could claim the same after being locked in an interrogation room with an angry Darth Vader. She shook her head, then instantly regretted the motion as a sharp stab of pain raced through her forehead. I don't know what I did to deserve this kind of luck. Maybe I was a Jedi in a previous life or something. She finally brought herself to look around, wincing as her muscles screamed in protest. The first thing she noticed was how clean everything was, spotless slate gray walls and floors, polished to a sheen that was usually only seen on starships. Ships had to be thoroughly cleansed to avoid transferring contagions from planet to planet. Blue Send Prison had no such regulations. So sometime while she was unconscious, someone had transferred her from the prison to this mysterious ship. Was she being transferred to a different installation? That seemed unlikely. The guards had always found it fun to rub in the fact that she would never leave Blue Sin for the rest of her short life. Whatever the ship was, she knew she was in the quarters. The strange thing was that there was no one else that she could see, and the Empire wouldn't transfer someone as insignificant as her on her own. She wasn't important enough to warrant a solitary transport. She slowly slid off the cot and stood on shaky legs, intent on finding out just what had happened to her. Her shoes had been one of the first things she'd lost when entering the prison months ago, and the starship floor was frigidly cold under her bare feet. She grimaced and curled her toes against the sensation, then gingerly limped toward the door. The wall was just as cold under her fingertips, and she almost thought she could see her breath on the air. The ship is running cold, she thought, her heart sinking with every step she took. Trying to avoid showing up on thermal scanners. Whatever the ship is, it obviously wants to stay hidden. "Hello?" she called hoarsely. She could hear her voice echo in the cramped room. There was no answer. With a pained grimace, she limped to the door, pressed the opening stud, and watched it slide open with a sigh. She peeked her head outside the door to find a long hallway lit from above with cylindrical illuminators. Next to her door was a security panel, but the keys were inscribed with strange letters she didn't recognize. She thought about trying out a couple simple commands, then decided against it. If this was a prison ship, it would probably send enforcement officers right to her location. But is this really a prison ship? The more she dwelled on the idea, the less believable it became. This ship seemed to have no cells, no guards, no ray shields, no turrets, nothing. Not even the Imperial wheel emblazoned on the wall to remind the crew that they served the Emperor above all else. So where am I? She almost screamed when she suddenly heard a door open somewhere nearby. She stifled it into a quiet gasp and squeezed up against the ice-cold wall, trying to make herself as small and inconspicuous as possible. Further down the hall, two people passed from one room to another while talking in hushed tones. Once their voices had faded, Jay leaned out and scanned the corridor. Empty once again, but she still heard voices coming from the room the two had entered. She crept forward and glanced inside, keeping her footsteps as quiet as possible. She saw two figures inside the room with their backs turned, obviously caught up in a heated debate. Her heart was racing uncomfortably fast in her chest. She needed to learn more about her current predicament, and she couldn't clearly hear their conversation from her hiding place outside. So against her better judgment, she slipped through the still-open door. A cursory examination of the area told her that she was in the captain's quarters, or something very akin to that. It was a medium-sized room, maybe about the size of the crew's quarters she had just left. There was a neat-looking bed tucked against one wall, some kind of storage closet along another, and a durasteel desk seeming to flow straight from the middle of the hull closest to her. Scattered across the desk were glowing holodocs with scrolling words she didn't have time to read. The two men who had spoken before were standing further in the room with their backs to her. One, possibly human, sported silver battle armor with red flashes and had his arms folded across his chest. The other one, wearing dull black and gray armor, was storing a short-barreled rifle in the closet. As the second man removed his round battle helmet, Jay got a clear look at the unmistakable T-shaped visor and swooping cheek arches that adorned the armored faceplate. Her blood ran cold at the sight. Mandalorians. Bounty hunters. Perfect. That was just what she needed right now. So she'd been kidnapped. If they thought she had some kind of price on her head, they were woefully misinformed. She'd only ever meant something to the Empire, and they'd already caught her. She ducked down next to the desk and listened to the conversation that was taking place between the two. "Remember Kallenich?" Silver Red was saying. "That stupid lizard went crazy as soon as we brought him to Mandalore. He was a transition. They're supposed to be crazy. It's in their blood." Jay was surprised at how young Black Gray's voice sounded. He almost sounded her age, or at least around 20. How could someone at her age give up a safe, legal career only to take up mercenary work? A Mandalorian, I guess, she thought. Aren't they trained to fight from birth? You're skirting the issue, Silver Red snapped. Answer the question. Black Gray sighed and turned away. As he came further into the light, Jay was almost relieved to see that he was indeed human beneath the armor. But his back was still mostly turned to her, and she couldn't make out his face in any detail that could help her identify him. She saw a flash of short brown hair, then ducked back behind the desk again before someone spotted her. She tucked herself into the smallest ball she could manage, and listened as Black Gray said, I barely know why I agreed to get her out of there. Tamara asked for a favor, so... Jay's confusion was mounting with every word she was hearing. Tamara had asked these men up to what? Rescue her? Kidnap her? Spirit her away to some Tatooine slave market, perhaps. Silver Red interrupted him angrily. Answer the question, Chin? Why in the hell did you rescue her too? Luum was the only target. She's of no value to anyone. Black Gray began to pull battered-looking armor plates off his combat suit, inspecting them before setting them aside. He hesitated, then said, I don't know, all right. I made a split-second decision. Let's just wait and see if it was a good one or a bad one. I hope for our sake it was a good one, Silver Red muttered. Nothing we can do now but wait for her to wake up. When Black Gray pulled the top of his torn and dirty combat suit over his head, Jay had to stifle a gasp behind her hand. The man's pale back was covered in old, ropey scars, each at least the length of her forearm. They zigzagged across his flesh, standing out lividly against his too pale skin. Jay counted at least 7, as well as what looked like a fresh blaster burn on his shoulder, hastily bandaged. Just what kind of battle could have left him with such scars, she couldn't even imagine. So how is she? Black Gray said as he examined his combat suit top. After a moment, he tossed it onto the cot and pulled an identical flight suit out of the storage closet in front of him. He pulled it over his head and began to replace the battered armor plates. Red Silver shrugged. Stable last time I checked her. She's probably just sleeping off the last of whatever drugs they gave her down there. Does your medical expertise shed any light on what she was doing in that prison? She looks like she was interrogated. She has multiple contusions on her face and neck, almost like she was choked and beaten, but I can't make out any finger marks from the assailant. Black Gray paused. That's interesting. Interesting isn't the word I would use. Silver Red shrugged. I gave her back the injections, so the majority of her bruises should clear up in a few hours. I was worried there would be internal bleeding, but it didn't look like any of her wounds penetrated the skin. You sound suspicious. Jay couldn't see Black Gray's expression with his back turned. She could only see him turn his head slightly and murmur, Are you scared of her? I'm cautious. She was put into that prison for a reason. Black Gray didn't say anything, but silently nodded. After some time of silence, Silver Red shifted his weight and said, We'd better check and see how close we are to an AR Shadow. Black Gray nodded in agreement. You go ahead. I'm going to finish up checking my stuff. Then I'll join you. Silver Red turned, and Jay's heart leapt into her throat. If they discovered her now, well, she didn't want to imagine the fate in store for her. Mandalorians weren't known for their kind hearts. She began to move back out of the door, intending to slip away without being seen. She didn't make it far before her foot accidentally bumped the edge of the desk. A small circular holoprojector teetered on the edge, then fell. She muttered a panicked curse under her breath and moved to catch it. Too slow. The projector bounced away across the metal floor, out of reach. Silver Red quickly reacted to the clatter, drawing a pistol and pointing it squarely at Jay's forehead. Black Gray also jumped into action, swiftly replacing his helmet and spinning with his rifle at the ready. Both rifles instantly cycled up, primed and ready to fire at a moment's notice. Jay let out a small squeak of terror and froze, her gaze darting between the barrels of each blaster. Her eyes felt as wide as the holoprojector she had knocked over. What would happen now? Would they kill her? Stun her and lock her back in the crew's quarters? She shuddered at the thought of being carted away to some mysterious planet by these two mercenaries. Please, she stammered, holding her hands up in surrender. I didn't mean to spy on you. Don't hurt me. But after a moment that seemed to last an eternity, Silver Red sighed and relaxed, holstering his pistol and moving toward her. Jay shrank back against the wall, trying to keep out of reach. Surprisingly though, Silver Red didn't try to grab her. Rather, he knelt in front of her and pulled off his helmet to reveal a kind face sporting a calming smile. The man beneath the armor had close-cropped black hair shot through with gray, and one of his eyes was slightly disfigured by the path of an old scar that stretched across his forehead. "Sorry about that," he said, offering her a hand. When Jay didn't move, he shook it for emphasis. "I'm a good guy," he insisted. "I won't bite, I promise." Jay was torn between the need to believe his words and the desire to turn and run as quickly as her battered body could manage. After a few tense moments, her self-preservation instinct lost the debate. She cautiously took the man's hand and let him help her to her feet. "You just caught us by surprise, that's all," Silver Red said with a reassuring smile. We weren't expecting to have a guest on this trip." Black Gray said nothing and just stood in the corner with his rifle lowered, staring at her. She stared back, looking into the faceless battle helmet until she shuddered and moved her gaze back to Silver Red. "We weren't expecting you to be awake for a few hours yet," the older man said as he opened the door and led her out into the hall. His hand on her shoulder was gentle, but commanding, and even then we didn't know if you'd be able to walk. Jay pulled out of the man's grasp and turned on him. "Wait a minute. Who are you? And where am I? Oh, right. Introductions are in order." Silver Red thumped a clenched fist against his chest plate. "I'm Raymond Mateo. My buddy back there is Cheen Hedden, and you're currently aboard his personal transport, Void. What's your name?" "Jay Colta," she said, narrowing her eyes. How did I get here?" Rain let out a long breath and rolled his eyes. "That's the question of the day, isn't it? Short version, we were headed down to that lovely prison of yours to capture an Imperial general by the name of Lewin." "You're bounty hunters," she said. "Both of you." "Actually, I only work part-time. Hedden back there is the complete bounty hunting package. A 7-year veteran, actually." Jay blinked, feeling her headache begin to return. This was all a little too much information for her in her still feeble state. "Anyway," Rain continued, "when he found out we were going to be passing through, your buddy Tammer gave Hedden a call, discreetly of course, and said he'd give us Lewin's location, free of charge. But when we got down there, he asked for a small favor, getting you out of prison." "You're the old friends he mentioned," Jay realized with dawning understanding. "I have a backup plan," her friend had said. "Just some old friends who happen to be in the neighborhood." "Probably." Rain nodded and scratched at the stubble on his jaw. "We go back a long way. But enough of that for now. You need to rest for a while. You look pretty battered." "I feel pretty battered." Rain raised an eyebrow. "Those imps didn't treat you well down there, did they?" She sighed and held a hand to her aching head as the memory of Darth Vader's angular face mask flashed through her mind's eye. "You have no idea." "Well, you don't have to worry about that anymore. Not if we have anything to say about it. Follow me and we'll head to the med bay." She nodded and followed Rain further down the central hall, leaving the black-gray Mandalorian behind. The door to the captain's cabin slid shut, obscuring him from view. Towards the back of the ship, Rain keyed open the door and motioned her inside. Through the door was a small room about the size of an Imperial general's uniform closet. But squeezed into the area was a medical table and a small cabinet that she supposed carried emergency supplies. It looked surprisingly versatile for such a small place. Rain moved toward the cabinet and pulled out a simple hypo spray full of a clear liquid. As he turned, he must have noticed her expression of discomfort. She'd had more than enough experiences with needles for one lifetime. "I just want to give you one more Bacta injection," he calmly explained. "Just to be sure you're okay inside and out." Are you sure you know what you're doing?" "Of course. I'm a certified emergency med tech." He smiled. "More or less. So you're a part-time bounty hunter and a doctor, she asked skeptically. Despite her reservations, she took a seat on the medical table, reluctantly rolled up her sleeve, and offered the man her arm. "And a farmer," he said proudly as he swabbed her arm with rubbing alcohol. "All wrapped up into a single well-armored package." She nodded and waited for him to do his work. She couldn't explain why, but she found herself slowly beginning to feel at ease around this man. She didn't sense any hostility from him, despite his fearsome-looking battle armor. And he hadn't beaten her or threatened to kill her yet, which was more than could be said for half the other strangers she'd met over the past 3 months. He quickly and efficiently injected the healing back into her arm, making sure the plunger on the syringe was completely depressed before retracting the needle. Jay blinked several times, a chilling sensation raced up her arm as the Bacta took effect. "So, you said I was beaten. Just how bad is it?" "Well, let me take a look." He touched her chin and turned her face slightly, his chiseled features drawn into a thoughtful frown. After a moment, he turned her face the other way. He grunted quietly, then began feeling along her forehead, probably checking for fractures. After a few moments, he folded his arms across his armored chest and said, "Well, for now you look like Osik, but you should be as good as new in a few days. There doesn't seem to be any damage a few Bacta injections can't fix." "That's a relief, I think," she added, not quite sure what Osik meant. "When I woke up, I was so sore it felt like I was about to die." "That's probably natural, considering all you've been through." She rubbed her arm absently, shivering as the Bacta continued its work. "So where exactly are we going?" "Right now we're headed to Nar Shaddaa to turn over that scum Lewin and get paid. If you want, we can drop you off there. If not, we'll give you a lift to wherever you need to go. It's the least we can do." "And after that, where are you two headed?" "Back to Mandalore," he replied with a small smile. "Mandalore?" she asked. She'd heard the planet's name in the past, but exactly where she didn't remember. "Is that like your home?" He nodded. "A safe haven for bounty hunters and the biggest spot of anti-Imperial sentiment in our sector of the galaxy." "Oh," Jay said, nodding and feeling slightly foolish. "Of course. Mandalorians from Mandalore. That makes sense." He let out a short laugh. "We Mandoid have been known to use our heads from time to time." "You're teasing me." Jay narrowed her eyes, but couldn't hold back a grin of her own. She found it hard not to like this man, no matter how many times she told herself he hunted people for a living. He seemed like a kind person, and that was certainly the last thing she'd expected to find when she'd woken up. "Maybe," he said, heading for the door and replacing his silver-red helmet. "Maybe not. For now, I'll let you rest. If you need anything, I'll be in the cockpit. Just give me a call over the ship's intercom, and I'll come running." She stopped him in the doorway. "Before you go, I'd like to ask you a question." "Shoot." His voice sounded very different, much more menacing, coming from his helmet's vocoder. But his posture belied his fearsome voice. He leaned casually against the doorframe, folding one boot over the other and hooking his thumbs into his utility belt. She hesitated. "Your friend? I don't remember his name." "Vader." Rain supplied. "Yes. You said he was the one that got me out of that prison." "Him and Tamer, yeah." Rain looked suddenly uncomfortable, shifting his weight from foot to foot. "I'd like to know why." He shook his head with a weary sigh. "You and me both, sweetheart. You and me both?" She was about to ask what he meant by that, but he interrupted her before she could. "You should try to get some sleep. Get used to your well-deserved freedom." She raised an eyebrow and grinned despite herself. "Is that advice, or an order?" "Whichever you prefer. As long as you're aboard the Void, no one's going to bother you. You're safe with us. I can't guarantee that." She nodded, still smiling. "Thanks. And thanks for getting me out of there." "It was our pleasure," he said, then turned and disappeared into the hall beyond. She listened to the sound of his heavy footfalls as they faded down the hall towards the cockpit. Then the medbay door sheath closed, cutting her off from the rest of the ship and giving her some semblance of privacy for the first time in over 3 months. She lay back on the med table and closed her eyes, taking in a deep breath as she rested her hands over her stomach and felt her own slow, measured breathing. "Get used to your well-deserved freedom," he said. She thought she could do that. Chapter 9. The Debate. Raim sat down in the co-pilot's seat with a sigh, then looked over at Vheden, who was scanning through the nearest star systems on the ship's database. "You okay?" Vheden's helmet was resting on the floor next to the pilot's chair. The bounty hunter's face was folded into a dark scowl as he punched at the controls to bring up another planet's info file. He rubbed at his chin as his eyes stared off into space, not really looking at anything and certainly not reading the info files placed before him. Looking inward, not out, as Brianna liked to say. Raim put a hand on Vheden's armored shoulder and gently shook his friend. "Hey, you listening?" Vheden started and quickly returned to reality, blinking a few times before settling more securely into his seat. "Sorry, I was thinking about the contract." Raim knew that hollow tone in his friend's voice. He adopted it whenever something was weighing heavily on his mind. The black-armored Mandalorian nodded. "We were supposed to get in and out of there with minimal casualties, but we left a lot of wreckage behind back there. So the plan didn't go off flawlessly. It happens." Vheden let out a short, sarcastic laugh. "Yeah, ain't that a bitch? And they paid for it with 30 innocent lives." Raim wasn't surprised to hear Vheden had been counting the casualties. It wasn't because he was keeping score. Still, he felt compelled to point out, "They're Imperials, remember. I don't think you should be feeling sorry for them, 'cause they sure wouldn't be feeling sorry for you if the roles were reversed." "I don't feel sorry for them. They were my enemies, standing between me and my target. They would have killed me, given the chance. But, at the same time, all they were doing was minding their own business, doing their job. And we killed them in cold blood." He shook his head and muttered, "There's no honor in picking a fight for no good reason." "Such is life," Raim pointed out. This was not a new debate between them. Vheden could be an unstoppable killing machine at times, but such power came at a heavy mental cost. His friend nodded and a familiar cold, steely look came into his eyes. "Yeah, such is life. Kill or be killed, huh?" He frowned and rubbed his tired eyes. After a few moments, that steely look vanished in favor of a softer, much more tired expression. "So how's the girl?" Raim chuckled, eager to change the subject. "Better behaved and better looking than Loon, that much I'll tell you." "I'm serious." "Seriously," Raim said. "She's one hell of a catch, Vheden. While I was checking her wounds, I ran a facial recognition program on my helmet's HUD and cross-checked it with the name she gave me. Then I had Jam back on Mandalore hack her file and send it to me. He was pretty impressed by her record." "He got the job done fast," Vheden said. "You were only gone for a few minutes. It's probably a slow weekend back home. But guess what came back?" Vheden raised an eyebrow in curiosity while Raim pulled up a hacked Imperial data file on the terminal in front of them. "Jashia Elmiri Nerkolta," Raim said as the file appeared on the largest holoscreen in the cockpit. "Fifth child of Caddo Kolta and Antonia Nair. She has 6 siblings. Can you imagine?" The Imperial record popped up with the column of numbers indicating age, height, date of birth, date of medicinal vaccinations, etc. The holopic attached to the report showed the image of an attractive young woman in Imperial uniform, with long, wavy brown hair and dark brown eyes. Stitched in red onto the left side of her uniform chest was the call sign Phoenix. "She doesn't look much like her picture," Vheden observed. "Give the bruises a few days to clear up," Raim said. "She'll be back to normal in no time. Let's see what it says here. She was born on Corellia and graduated with flying colors from EDU Center 657 to 283. Ran into a little trouble with Imperial law enforcement while still a teenager for some minor things. Trespassing on private property irritated Imperial enforcement officers. Sounds like she had quite a keen interest in clone troopers when she was a kid. Spent 2 months in juvenile incarceration for illegal skyhopper racing. She was a child prodigy with aircraft, apparently, But that was not really where her heart was. She applied repeatedly for active duty in the Imperial Navy at the age of 16, just after they changed the legal limit for military work. Vader rubbed his chin thoughtfully. Where did she apply? Get this, she applied first for enlistment with the Stormtrooper 210th Platoon, but was turned away on gender-based issues. The Empire doesn't allow female stormtroopers after all. She was apparently pretty steamed about that and tried to take it all the way to the courts, but no one would listen. She then applied for Imperial Special Forces, Logistics and Tactics Division, but was turned away again because she had too little experience in the field. For the next year, her application popped up in nearly every combat outfit the Empire had to offer. The girl's got some spunk, huh? She sounds like quite the patriot, Vader murmured. Can we trust her with her obvious infatuation with the Empire's fighting forces? Well, let's keep looking here. She eventually landed a job as a fighter pilot with the 603rd TIE unit. Apparently the Navy is a little looser with gender regulations than the Stormtrooper battalions. Vader shrugged. Comes with the legacy of a formerly all-male clone army. Not many people want to break with that tradition. Yeah, well, the outfit she joined, Phantom Squadron. Over the next few years, she rose in rank until she was a full captain. Not bad? Not bad at all. Vader frowned thoughtfully. She must have some skill in the cockpit. Go on. Well, that's where it all hit the fan, apparently. About 3 months ago, this Phantom Squadron, among others, was dispatched to what's left of the Malachor system to mop up a little uprising happening there. Apparently these revolutionaries knew more and were better armed than the Empire thought. They were waiting for the imps and tore through them like a Nexu through glimmer-silk sheets. Out of about 50 pilots, our girl was the only survivor. A testament to her piloting abilities. The Empire sure didn't see it that way, Raim said, squinting as he read. She was accused and condemned for giving away battle plans and selling out her fellow pilots for a rather hefty sum. Her credit account spiked upwards of 100,000 creds in under 24 hours after the battle. He let out a low whistle and sat back in his chair. When the mighty fall, they take everyone else down with them. She didn't do it. Raim blinked and glanced over at Vader. What? She didn't do it. Tamar said she's innocent, and I believe him. Cheen, the credit statistics came with the file, Raim pointed out. The money's all there. It was planted, Vader said, by the Empire. Raim frowned. Come on, Cheen. I know you've had some rough deals with them in the past, but the Empire has the wealth of 1,000,000 worlds at its disposal. 100K. Pocket money for them? Okay, good point, but why? Why would the Empire give up so much money just for the heck of it? Why do Imperials do any of the crazy things they do? They want to look good for their superiors. These records show that the money wasn't wired to her account until a day or so after the battle was over. To most people, that looks like she was given the money when her employer received confirmation that the mission had gone to hell. Typical illegal thought process, right? Right? But a day after the battle, the Navy commander sending out the orders would have known they got their asses kicked when their pilots didn't come back with the report. And it doesn't take a genius to see that they needed a scapegoat. Since this woman was the only survivor, she was perfect scapegoat material, whether she wanted to be or not. So why did they go through so much trouble to interrogate her? I mean, if they knew it was all a lie, why would they bother? Her captors had nothing to do with it. I'm guessing only members of the upper echelon of her Navy outfit even know about the real reasons for the failure of the mission. Their necks were the ones on the line if they took responsibility for the failure, so they probably fed the whole traitor bit to the Emperor himself. It's all propaganda and misinformation. Vader leaned back in the pilot's seat and rubbed his chin again. What does the psych report say? Raim blinked a few times, then said, Vader, has anyone ever told you how smart you get when you're cranky? Brianna's pointed that out several times, yes. What's the psych report say? Raim turned back to the holo. Well, it says here that she is highly intelligent, able to process information slightly faster than most humans are capable of. She gets along well with others, and is efficiently able to work as part of a team. She's got good ratings across the board from the psych analysts. Hedden, he made a face, showing mock disgust. It says here she has a cheerful sense of humor, and is, for save us witty. Hedden frowned. Jokes can wait till after we get paid. Now isn't the time? Why? That steely note had returned to the black armored man's voice, and Raim narrowed his eyes in suspicion. What are you thinking? Hedden stared at the woman's jalopnik for several seconds before saying, she sounds like she would make a good bounty hunter herself. And with a skill set like hers, she could be a valuable ally. She would need some training, but... Raim started at his friend's words. What? You heard. You can't be serious. I mean, consider the recent partners you've worked with. List them: Kalinich, Dirge, Imran Katoro. You have Hedden pointed out. I'm not joking anymore, Cheen. These guys were the toughest of the tough, and they all got stupid and tried to whack you. I don't know about you, but I'm beginning to notice a pattern there. Is there any more in the psych file? Raim shook his head and pulled down the file. No, that's it. But let's just pretend I agree. I think she sounds like she's the perfect partner for you, Vaad. In fact, let's bring up your psych evaluation and compare them, shall we? Just to prove you two were made for each other. Hedden grimaced and moved to leave his seat, but Raim pushed him back down and said, No, sit down. I'm not done with my tirade. Come on, Raim, cut me some slack. No, Raim said, typing in some commands. I'm just evaluating your position. After a few moments, Jay's file disappeared, only to be replaced by another Imperial record. The personnel jalopnik had been deleted, replaced with the words classified Tier 3 in red letters. Raim said, reading through the psych report. Now what does this say? Subject shows extreme detachment from social roles, borderline sociopathic behavior, shows inclination toward self-destructive tendencies, despite apparent mental stability, ambiguous history. Overall, subject is not suitable for standard infantry. Recommendation: solitary special forces, assassination, and mercenary work. Raim looked at Hedden and raised an eyebrow. Now do those two psych reports seem to match up? Why no, I suppose they don't. Hedden grimaced again, then said, but you're leaving out all the good parts of the report. Look. He leaned closer to the screen and began to read aloud. Shows good social skills after some time, probably due to built-up trust, able to keep self-destructive tendencies in check, extremely flexible with teamwork, and able to function both as leader and follower as necessary. Extreme problem-solving abilities. Addendum. Recommendation: Special Forces, 2-man team. He sat back in the pilot seat and said, I've always worked better with a partner. You know this. Raim shook his head. I don't know, Hedden. I've got a bad feeling about this. Let's just see what happens when we get to Nar Shaddaa. For all we know, she'll want to jump ship there, and it won't even matter. Chapter 10. The Bounty Hunter. Nar Shaddaa, now Hutta system, Hut space. Jay felt the world lurch as the ship landed, waking her from a deep sleep. She glanced around the crew's quarters, where she was resting, then sat up, and the digital chrono displayed on the far wall. She'd been sleeping for almost 13 hours. She rubbed her eyes and yawned. She hadn't realized it at first, but after 3 months of being imprisoned, being free was exhausting. She swung her legs off the cot, but didn't stand. Her mind was drifting back to Karulak and the tumultuous events that had followed her escape. The last thing she remembered was Darth Vader beating her against the tabletop when she wouldn't give him the name of her non-existent employer. The next thing she knew, she was aboard this ship in the company of 2 bounty hunters. If there was ever a more dramatic turn of events, she'd like to see it. The hunter she'd spoken to, Raim, had said Tamar had called them. She hoped her friend was all right. The thought of the old clone bearing the brunt of the Empire's wrath made her shudder. But he was a veteran of both battles and Imperial rule, and knew what he was doing. He would find a way to rebound from the prison attack. He was resourceful, and if anyone could survive in the treacherous and paranoid dictatorship of the Empire, it was him. She stood, wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, and padded out of the room in her bare feet. The door sheathed shut behind her as she emerged into the large central corridor that spanned the entire length of the ship. Curious, being in the Navy, she'd become familiar with all the ships favored by the galaxy's worst scum, pirates, mercenaries, terrorists, criminal organizations, and bounty hunters alike. She could tell the difference between a Z-95 and an ARC 170 starfighter in her sleep. This ship, though, she didn't recognize anything about it. It bore subtle signs of Imperial design and manufacture, but mostly it was wholly alien. The bulkheads were too smooth, and there was a bank of holo terminals in the central room showing various newscasts and data feeds from across the galaxy. It looked like a private transport rather than any military vessel, and Imperials didn't care much for advances in the private sector of the hypernautics industry. She crossed the hall, searching for the refresher, and thumped the opening stud on a reinforced durasteel door. The panel next to the door buzzed harshly and began barking and hissing at her in a language she didn't understand. A light above the control panel glared red, and a deep thunk suggested that the door had been sealed. She quickly backed away and raised her hands in surrender, just in case the door had some other kind of security measures in place. The voice fell silent as soon as she stepped away from the door, and she let out a long breath. It would probably be smart to try a different door. Further down the hall was another door, just as protected as the one before. Unlike the other door, this one opened smoothly, almost beckoning her to enter. When she stepped inside, she realized that she had once again made a mistake. This sure wasn't the fresher. Large cages, laced with ray shield lining, were anchored to the walls. The ray shields were invisible, while shimmered in the air like a heat wave in the desert. Apart from the cages, the room was devoid of any kind of furniture or equipment. Holding cells for captured prisoners. This was more familiar bounty hunting equipment. I suppose you had something to do with this as well, a sullen voice suddenly said. Jay gasped and spun towards the sound. General Lewin was slouched against the wall, held captive within one of the cages. His nose was caked with dried blood, his hair was unkempt, and his once pristine uniform was smeared with dirt and filth. He looked up at her with tired eyes and hugged his knees close to his chest. Leave it to bounty hunters to be bold enough, or stupid enough, to lay siege to an Imperial prison just to get at a single general. And to get you, of course. Jay shook her head. No, I was a more recent addition to their plan. Oh. Lewin raised an eyebrow. And how exactly do you fit into their plan? She hesitated, wondering how much she should reveal to the general. This was the Imperial who had ordered her execution and torture after all. But another part of her, bolstered by her military training, told her that he was a superior officer. That made his question in order. I'm just hitching a ride, she finally said. Then I'm out of the Empire's way for good. Lewin snorted. So you think, there's nowhere you can go where we won't find you. We have the entire galaxy within the palm of our hand. No matter where you go, we'll be right behind you. Jay felt cold fury rise within her, shoving aside her memories of old military protocol. She gestured to the room around her, at the cages in particular. Seeing the predicament you're in right now, sir, she said, putting extra emphasis on the word, I don't think you will be one of the ones behind me. I've got a chance at a new life. Wherever you're going is definitely not going to be as pretty. Loon glared at her for a few moments. But when Jay just glared right back, he sighed and turned away. It was a few long, silent moments before her curiosity drove her to speak again. Why are bounty hunters after someone as insignificant as you in the first place? Loon shook his head, still not looking at her. Some time ago, I was in charge of a prison facility on Rylith. It was harsh but secure. Similar to Blue Send in that regard. And my men's favorite pastime happened to be Twi'lek hunting. Jay's lip curled in disgust. That's awful. It kept the men sharp and their morale high. What was there to worry about? I let it continue. Of course, the actions were discovered and reported, and I was subsequently transferred to Blue Send. where there were no natives to incite into rebellion. And since then, certain Twi'lek crime lords have placed substantial prices on my head. Your barbarian friends must have taken a contract to bring me in. I don't think they're the barbarians here, she pointed out. Besides, you should be more thankful they decided to bring you in alive. They didn't have to. Loon glared up at her and sneered. You think you're in a position to mock me? You think you have it better than I do? You're almost directly responsible for the destruction of the entire prison. The Empire will have law enforcement on you the moment you go near a civilized system. Your bounty hunter friends caught me, but it's only a matter of time before our people get you. Your people, Jay corrected angrily. I want nothing to do with the Empire anymore. You are all murderous, scum-sucking liars in my eyes. And as for you, Lewin, you deserve whatever fate these crime lords have cooked up for you. It's better than what you had planned for me. As she turned to leave the room, still quivering with rage, Lewin laughed and called after, Vader was right about you. You sold your squadron out for credits. I think you will fit right in with these immoral mercenaries. You won't be alive to see it, Jay shot back over her shoulder. Before the captive Imperial could retort, the door slammed shut behind her. With a frustrated sigh, she turned into the corridor with the intent to return to her quarters and her bed. Talking to the former general had left a bad taste in her mouth, and she couldn't wait to put some distance between them. She didn't make it far before she ran headlong into what felt like a solid wall of metal. She heard a grunt of surprise as she staggered back against the wall. Looking up to see who, or what, she'd run into, she saw the other bounty hunter. What was his name? Seen something? I'm sorry, the man said, his voice soft and calm. He inclined his helmeted head in apology. I didn't see it. No, it's my fault, Jay said a little distractedly. She was staring at the man, studying him closely. She was interested to finally meet the man who had rescued her from her incarceration. He was about her height, a little taller since he was able to look down at her slightly. He was clad in dull black battle armor with 2 gray stripes over the left side of his helmet and had a single large gray stripe down his chest. Though the paint on his armor had faded over the years, it was still kept almost immaculately clean. Jay frowned at that. The few mercenaries she'd seen during her employ in the military had sported their battle scars with pride. They wore armor that was covered in scratches, blaster burns, even dents. The fact that this man had next to none suggested that he had either seen little of combat or was skilled enough that he hadn't been shot often. Jay couldn't tell which, but was willing to bet on the latter. An assortment of brown leather ribbons dangled from his right forearm and shoulder and a kind of decorative tassel drape that gave his armor the exotic look of an ancient warrior. And, if Jay saw it correctly, he was wearing some kind of combat skirt, colored black like the rest of his armor. She'd seen stormtrooper commanders and ARC troopers wear similar garments, which they called a kama. The sinister-looking T-visor of his battle helmet seemed to stare right through her, and she shuddered slightly as he regarded her intently, obviously studying her as closely as she was watching him. He bore the unmistakable air of a veteran warrior, yet something about him made her uneasy. She couldn't quite put her finger on what or why. He finally held out a hand in greeting. It's good to see you up and about. Rain was worried you were seriously injured. She slowly shook the offered hand, still staring at him. I don't think we've been properly introduced, he continued. My name is Cheen Hedden. Jay Colta, she said. Pleased to meet you. She was surprised by his voice, mostly. She had expected either some rough, gravelly, sneering drawl of a pirate or a voice and accent similar to a clone trooper's. The original clone template had supposedly been a Mandalorian, after all. But his voice was quiet and calm, bearing no accent of any kind. It was almost completely forgettable, which she was sure came in handy in his line of work. It was easy to tell this was no mindless mercenary. A sharp mind lay behind the metal of that helmet. This was a man to be reckoned with. She linked her arms in front of her, shifting her balance awkwardly from foot to foot. She didn't want to be under this man's masked scrutiny any longer than necessary, but she was in debt to him. You're the one who rescued me from that prison, right? I am, I remember. A memory rose unbidden to mind of the blurry image of a man in black battle armor carrying her through fire and explosions. I think I remember you helping me out of that cell.
Thank you.
He bowed his head, again with that kind of slow warrior's grace. You're welcome. I believed Tamara's story that you were innocent, so I agreed to help you escape. Not the smartest decision if you ask Rain, but it was necessary. I couldn't let you rot in that prison cell. You're very kind, she said. She hesitated, then added, I guess I owe you my life. He made a quiet, raspy noise that sounded like a snort. You don't owe me a thing, Miss Coulter. I was happy to help. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have some business to take care of. He stepped past her, pulled a pistol from his holster on his hip, and keyed open the door to the room full of cages. As he stepped inside, she heard him say, Come on, General. You've got a date with a pretty pissed-off crime lord. A few moments later, he shoved Lewin out through the door and led him down the hall at gunpoint. As the bounty hunter passed her, he glanced at her over his shoulder. Let me deal with this scum first, he said. Then we'll drop you off at the nearest starport. From there you can get to wherever you need to go. She nodded and watched him shove his captive down the hall. She felt a strange kind of satisfaction as the whimpering coward was led towards the exit ramp at the back of the ship. Loon was a spineless menace, and he was finally getting what he deserved. He wanted to kill me, she thought. He kept pushing to stop the execution delays Tamara set up. And if what he said about Rylith was true, well, he's finally getting what's coming to him. Good riddance. Then she turned away, towards the sleeping quarters, and didn't look back. Chapter 11. The Kingpin. As chaotic, filthy, and loud as it was, an AR shadow was a sight for sore eyes. Void's exit ramp groaned as it lowered to the landing pad beneath. A thick, muggy breeze tugged Vaden's comma about, making him look even more threatening as he strode onto the landing pad amid gusts of coolant steam and downdraft from his ship. The former General Loon was just ahead of him, still held at gunpoint. The Imperial, bound and gagged to avoid any last minute complications, was shaking so badly it looked like he'd contracted a bad case of Kayakian tremor sickness. He'd also turned a strange shade of green since touching down. He obviously knew what was waiting for him on this landing pad. As he stepped free of his ship's shade, his helmet visor darkened to compensate for the blindingly bright lights of NAR Shadow's entertainment district. Thousands of holographic signs offered means of recreation and pleasure to 100 different species, some of it legal, most of it less so. And that was just in the few hundred feet that he could see with the naked eye. NAR Shadow, the infamous smuggler's moon of Nal Hutta, had a population of trillions, and that population continued to fluctuate every day. The crowded skylanes had been bustling day in and day out for thousands of years, and it seemed unlikely that that would stop anytime soon. His helmet's audio dampers attempted to muffle the roar of the endless speeders and ships as they passed overhead. They were only partially successful. He set off across the pad as he saw his employer waiting with a retinue of guards, mercenaries, and majordomos. The blue-skinned Twi'lek crime lord known as King Latu stood patiently, hands folded over an intricately carved scepter planted on the ground between his feet. His heavily tattooed leku twitched sporadically, the only sign that he was excited for the delivery. His bodyguards, a collection of battle droids and organics, waited on either side with weapons drawn and trained on both General Lewin and the bounty hunter escorting him. When Henan drew nearer, King Latu shot him a wide smile and spread his arms in greeting. Chief Henan. The Twi'lek laughed in Huttese. I trust you have a gift to present to me. Here he is, as promised, Vaden said as he approached, throwing Lewin in front of him. The general sprawled onto his front, frantically trying to cover his head lest he receive a swat from King Latu's scepter. Two of the king's bodyguards quickly darted forward and caught him under the arms to haul him to a kneeling position. Vaden gestured to the battered old man. One Imperial general, as per your instructions. He's a little beat up, but you will find he still has plenty of life left in him. King Latu drew back his expensive black-necked fur robe and knelt in front of the former general, reaching out a single long-nailed hand to caress Lewin's cheek. The Imperial cringed away, but a guard's firm hand on his shoulder kept him rooted in place. "Ah, my friend," Latu purred to the quivering man. "How I have waited for this moment. 12 long years I have watched you from the shadows as you allowed your men to slaughter my people. You watched from your plush, comfy offices and barely batted an eyelash as Twi'lek blood stained the sands of my homeworld." Lewin, who obviously didn't understand Huttese, moaned in fear. Latu cocked his head, a smile stretching across his dark blue lips. "What, you don't enjoy the company of the great King Latu?" He gestured to the city around him. "You don't enjoy the sights so beautiful in Airshada. Many labor their whole lives in search of the decadence this city offers. Yet you clearly wish to be anywhere else in the galaxy." Loon still didn't understand, and began to cry harder. King Latu's face broke into a full grin, revealing stained black teeth. He reached toward the general and pinched his face in one hand. "No dis, Imperial," he said in heavily accented basic. "For all my many faults, I'll still love my people. But ya think to hunt my kind for sport." He shook his head. No. Now what we do is this. I'll turn ya loose on an Airshada, and my kind hunt you. We see how sporting ya game truly is." Loon went so pale, Hedden was sure his slate gray uniform lightened a few shades. "You sure that's smart? An Airshada is technically Imperial territory, you know." The hunter raised a skeptical eyebrow that was hidden behind the faceplate of his helmet. He'd be damned if he went through all the trouble to bring the general here only to have Latu let him escape. "If he gets away, you have my number?" "Ah, Hedden, my old friend," the king laughed. Reverting back to Huttese, "you can trust my men to ensure that slime doesn't escape. Now tell me, how has the galaxy been treating you?" Better than in the past, Hedden didn't bother to speak Huttese. He knew Latu could understand him regardless. Latu stepped forward and grasped Hedden's shoulders in a ceremonial Twi'lek embrace. "It means a great deal to me that you were willing to hunt down this Deshada," he spat in Luna's general direction as he said it, "even at the price you proposed. My people are in your debt," he said. "You have done me a great service I will not soon forget." He barked at his thugs to step forward. One of them, a Gamorrean, lumbered up with the datapad in his meaty hand. He held it out to Hedden with a snort and grumble. Hedden took the pad as King Latu said, "Plug in the number of your account, and the money will be transferred with the push of a button. I'm sure you are familiar with the process." Hedden nodded and entered the number of one of his many ghost accounts, credit accounts, that served as waypoints for the money as it passed through a confusing chain of different societies, banks, and organizations before finally ending up in his private account, safely laundered and completely untraceable. Once satisfied that the money was all there, he handed the pad back to Latu, who tucked it into his dark robe. Their business concluded, the king bowed with another black-toothed smile. "I wish you many happy hunts for your future, Master Hedden. Preferably in my employment, not against it." Hedden inspected his personal credit summary on his HUD and found to no surprise that the money was all there. Latu was eccentric, but he was certainly a reliable employer. That was refreshing. "Keep coming through on your payments, Latu," he said, "and I'll keep coming back for work." "Of course. It's just good business. Now I must bid you farewell. As you say, Retursai, MHI, Vod." Hedden bowed his head, genuinely impressed at the crime lord's usage of the Mandalorian language. Latu shot him one last grin. Then he spun, his robe flowing out behind him, and barked at his thugs. "Bring the Imperial. We have much to do." Hedden turned silently and strode back up the ramp into his ship. This job was done. Time to leave an Airshada behind. Chapter 12. The Decision. Jakeen opened the door to the cockpit. The two bounty hunters were seated within, each busy with their own separate tasks. Hedden was piloting the ship towards the nearest starport, staring rigidly out the viewport and keeping his helmeted gaze fixed on incoming ships. His fingers flashed across the ship's controls with a familiarity that came only with years of experience. Rain was on comms with someone in the adjacent seat, but exactly who was a mystery. Yes, we're both fine. We have one last thing to take care of. Then we're on our way home. Uh-huh. Love you too, sighed Erica. Goodbye. Jay paused, surprised. Was Rain married? She had always thought that bounty hunters were ruthless, greedy anarchists, barely above criminals in the social pecking order. Such a lifestyle left little time for meaningful relationships, or so she had thought. I guess that's another prejudice proved wrong. Rain finally swiveled in his seat to greet her, a friendly smile on his face. Hi there. Thought of the place you're going to spend your glorious vacation? She fidgeted a little. Actually, yes. Mandalore. Her words were met with exactly the reaction she had been expecting. There was silence in the cockpit. Rain blinked a few times, uncomprehending, then laughed. Chief Hedden remained silent, focused on piloting the ship. I mustn't have heard you right, Rain said. It almost sounded like you said. You heard just fine, Jay said. I want to go to Mandalore. With you too. The older man raised an eyebrow and glanced in Hedden's direction. The other bounty hunter made no motion to acknowledge his friend's gaze. That's very flattering, the older man said after a few long moments. But Mandalore isn't exactly the galaxy's greatest vacation spot. I mean, I guess the woods are pretty and Keldabe's a riot over the weekend when all the drunks come out to play, but... She shook her head. You don't understand. I don't want to go there to lay low or hide. I want to become a bounty hunter, and I want you to teach me. It looked as if words had completely abandoned Rain. He obviously hadn't expected her to make such a decision. He scratched his head in confusion, and even the uncommunicative Hedden tipped his head towards them, listening intently to the conversation despite his feigned indifference. But why? Rain asked. You seem like a nice enough girl. Why not head for Naboo, find yourself an equally nice guy and, settle down? Why do you want to be a bounty hunter? You sound very disparaging of your own profession, Hedden quietly pointed out. Rain shot a glare at the man, then turned back to Jay in expectation of an answer. I want to become a bounty hunter, she explained, because before Hedden dropped him off, I had a conversation with General Lewin. And I suddenly realized that the galaxy is filled to the brim with people like him, corrupt, arrogant, manipulative, cowardly shutters who need to be shown that they don't control everyone. She eased herself into the gunner's seat, linking her hands in her lap. I read the reports from Malachar after I was in prison. My superior officers branded me a traitor and put all the blame for that loss on my head. They deserve to be punished. Rain glanced again at Hedden, but said nothing. Jay took a deep breath and continued, but they won't be punished. Not by other Imperials at least. I figure if the Mandalorians can give me a shot at bringing bastards like that to some kind of justice, that's something I want to be part of. Rain raised an eyebrow. So you want to single-handedly make the galaxy a better place. That's noble, but... No. Jay shook her head. I'm not some kind of altruistic Jedi. But I do want to punish the people who framed me and threw me in prison. Them and everyone else like them. For a third time, Rain glanced at Hedden. Jay got the distinct impression that in the end, all this was up to him. After a moment, the black-armored bounty hunter shrugged. If that's her choice, I hope you understand what you're doing, Jay, Rain said, deadly serious now. Bounty hunting isn't all guns, grenades, and girls like they show in Halavids. It's a lot more intense than you think. I understand. You'd have to be trained from the ground up. All new tactics, all new weapons, everything. And no offense, but you'd have to be a lot tougher than you are right now. She nodded. I can do that. You're sure? Positive. I've never been so sure of anything in my life. She was telling the truth. While in the Navy, she had befriended many people and had enjoyed her time there. But in the back of her mind, she'd always known that she was only there because she had exhausted all her other options. Now she felt like she was making a serious decision, one that she knew would pay off in the end. Hedden set the ship on autopilot for a moment and spun in his seat. With a sigh, he leaned back in his chair and folded his arms across his armored chest, fixing her with a powerful stare that she could almost feel even through the tinted T-visor of his helmet. She stared right back, confident that he couldn't change her mind now. Once you decide to do this, the hunter said, there's no going back. You either give it everything you've got or you die. Is that a threat? Just a simple fact. This galaxy has too many amateur hunters who have no clue what they're doing and are more than willing to kill a fellow hunter for a few extra credits. It's a rough trade by nature. The margin for error is very, very small. He jerked his thumb over his shoulder, gesturing to the bustling metropolis of Nar Shaddaa still visible through the front viewport. Out there, it's survival of the fittest. Kill or be killed. She hesitated, pondering his words. They didn't change her mind. I understand. He stared at her for a moment longer, long enough that she began to think he didn't believe her. But then he nodded, satisfied, and turned back to the ship's controls without another word. All right then, Raim sighed, still looking uncertain. Mandalore it is. Sheen. Already on our way, Haddon replied. The deck trembled as he pulled out of Nar Shaddaa skylanes and headed for open space. A few minutes later, the space outside the viewport began to burn red-hot as the ship fought its way out of the moon's atmosphere. Jay gripped the edges of her chair as the deck beneath her feet began to shake violently. Once they had broken free of the atmosphere and the ship's interior had calmed, Raim looked to her again, giving her one last chance to change her mind. Point of no return right here, he said. You're sure you know what you're doing? She took a deep breath, knowing this was either going to be the best choice she had ever made or the worst possible mistake. She thought she would feel more nervous making such a life-altering decision. The entire galaxy was literally lying in wait before her, and this choice would doubtlessly plunge her into a part of it she couldn't even begin to imagine. But her heartbeat was steady and calm, and no butterflies fluttered in her stomach. The decision was already made. Something told her the decision had been made the moment her superiors had locked her away. The Jedi used to talk about destiny, and how the Force occasionally influences a person's life, she thought as she watched the stars glitter beyond the ship's front viewport. Maybe this is what it feels like. She nodded silently. I want to do this. Then buckle up, Haddon said, reaching for the control panel in front of him, and prepare for lightspeed. He pulled a lever down, and the stars became blurs. With an explosion of light and sound, the ship blasted into hyperspace, leaving the glowing orb of Nar Shaddaa far behind.